This session is going to be going over the different theories of Freud. So, psychosexual theory, psychoanalytic, going through id, ego, superego, the differences related to those and concepts relating to those different concepts as well. And then going through the defense mechanisms to wrap it all together, and then going through practice questions to allow for you to not just memorize, but understand and be able to apply the answers when you go inside of the exam to kick it directly in the chest to get the job done. Before I get into it, a huge push is never to memorize anything. So if you're not understanding in any of the concepts, or you're feeling like you're getting overwhelmed based on the sheer magnitude of the possibilities, do not beat yourself up, but give yourself grace and then push yourself to not memorize it, but to recognize and apply it to questions, because that's the important thing. Is you don't have to know everything that is on the exam. You simply have to be able to recognize and apply the answer choices. And even if you don't know any of the answer choices, being able to rule out the ones that you do and potentially going with an answer that you have no idea with, based on the fact that you studied. So again, the goal is to recognize and apply it to questions to allow for you to go to the exam to kick it directly in the chest to get the job done. Let's start off with psychosexual theory. And there are a couple of mnemonics that I would recommend utilizing to keep the stages in order, or to help you be able to recognize and apply them when you see them. But if you already have a way of being able to recognize and apply them, then that is a-okay. But if you're looking for a way to keep the stages in order and allow for you to be able to identify them when you see them, there are a couple that I would recommend. The first one is onions and potatoes look great. So each beginning letter of this mnemonic is going to identify the stage. So onions, oral, and A, anal, potatoes, P, phallic, L, look, latent, and G, great, genital. So the stages: oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital. Onions and potatoes look great. Another one, if that one doesn't resonate with you, because some people don't like vegetables, that's a-okay. Old age prisoners love grapes, so they prefer fruit. So not going with the vegetables. So similar idea: old, oral, age, A, anal, prisoners, P, phallic, love, L, latent, and grapes, G, genital. So each of those can help you recognize and apply the stages when your back is against the wall in the exam. And the thought process behind this is Freud believed that personality developed through a series of childhood stages and events where pleasure-seeking energies of the id, and we'll get into the different types of personality and the different psychoanalytic concepts in a little bit, become focused on certain areas, which is often related to sexual sensitivity or libido. If certain issues are not resolved at the appropriate stages, fixations can occur. So somebody could be stunted within some of these stages and not progress unless the fixation is rectified. So fixations are a persistent focus on earlier psychosexual stages. And we're now going to get into each of the stages. So the first stage up to bat is going to be the oral stage, which begins at birth and goes until 1 year old. But again, if somebody has a fixation, it can continue on beyond that. But when you think of oral, think of mouth, because it's going to be the fixation related to the mouth and survival. Why? Because the infant is primarily focused on survival. And how do people survive? By eating and consuming nutrients through their mouth. So interactions occur through their mouth or oral. So the rooting and sucking reflex are super duper important, based on the fact that young children are not able to fend for themselves. So the mouth is vital to eating, and the infant derives pleasure from oral stimulation through gratifying activities such as tasting and sucking. And that's why a young child, they are unaware of what is going on. But if you put something up towards their mouth, they're going to believe that it is a survival strategy and technique based on the fact that previous experiences derive pleasure and survival through their mouth. So, since the infant is entirely dependent on their caretakers, oftentimes those who are responsible for feeding, the child develops a sense of trust and comfort through that oral stimulation. So that's the important thing is there's now establishing relationships and focusing 100% on survival. And the only way that they can survive at this age is by eating. However, the primary conflict, and there's going to be primary conflicts for most of the stages, is going to be based on the weaning process. So the child must become less dependent on their caretakers over time. So a fixation occurs when the child or individual has a dependency on substances or relationships and or aggressive behavior when they feel like their needs are not being met. So a fixation, remember, is when they're not progressing past this. So this could look like them not having consistent feeding or consistent survival techniques and strategies based on their parents or caregivers neglecting them or being absent within their situation. So that is going to be where somebody is not going to have their needs met and they're going to react in some way, shape, or form. So a fixation over longer periods of time leads to problems with drinking alcohol, smoking, eating, nail biting, or even finger picking based on the fact that that is a way that they can cope via their mouth, which is a part of the oral stage. So kind of a quick review. When you think of oral, think of mouth because it's going to be a young child utilizing their mouth for survival based on the fact that that is how they are going to get nutrients, which is going to drive life within their situation. So the way that they're going to create a relationship with their parent and or caregiver is going to be based on feeding because they can trust that their parent or caregiver is going to feed them in some way, shape, or form. The primary conflict is going to be the weaning process where the child becomes less dependent on their parents and caregivers, and they must start trying to feed themselves. So a fixation would be where they were not able to count on their parents or caregivers some of the times or all of the time. And when they feel like their needs are not being met currently, they will now have reactions or explosions or cope internally based on trying to find some type of pleasure derived from their mouth. The next stage is going to be the anal stage. So the anal stage is from 1 to 3 years old, but again, it could be further along depending on if somebody has a fixation. So oral, think of mouth, anal, think of butt, based on the fact that the main goal here is going to be toilet training. So Freud believed the primary focus of libido, sexual energy, was on controlling the bladder and bowel movements. So the major conflict here is going to be toilet training. Not just whether somebody was able to be toilet trained or not, but what did that process look like? And what was their environment doing in order to promote or even decrease the likelihood of a successful training related to the toilet? So the child has to learn how to control his or her bodily needs. So developing this control leads to a sense of accomplishment and independence. However, with anything, there could be success as well as there could be failure. So success within toilet training is dependent on the way in which a parent or caregiver reacts or approaches toilet training. So for example, a parent that utilizes praise and or rewards for utilizing the toilet at the appropriate time encourages positive outcomes. Again, if somebody does something positive, rewarding them increases the likelihood that they want to do it in the future, which kind of goes back into that operant conditioning type mentality, as well as it helps the child feel comfortable and confident while trying. So positive experience during the stage, the anal stage, serve as the basis for how people feel confident and become competent, productive, and creative adults. Stated in a different way, if somebody was given the opportunity to make a mistake, given positive feedback as well as advice on how to improve, rather than being bulldozed, demeaned, and degraded for not doing something perfectly, that child is going to grow up as an adult, creating things more freely and being able to develop things that may not exist based on the fact that they're willing and able to take a risk on themselves. On the other side of the coin, failure occurs when the parents provide punishment, discouraging words, or degrading words, and even shame or ridicule the child for not utilizing the toilet at the appropriate time. So, harsh environments around toilet training can cause people to be more anxious or lack confidence when engaging in new behaviors. So the child's reaction can be predicated on particular people. So there may be people in their life that are not as harsh around it, but when the people that come around that are harsher around, they are more on edge or feel like they're on eggshells of like, man, I can't make a mistake around this individual. But if that individual is gone, and they're around somebody that's more caring and kind and positive to them, they may feel more willing and open to making mistakes. So, again, the environment and the people in that environment are going to create comfortability or discomfort depending on the presence that they bring. So, a fixation here, which again is where somebody doesn't progress at the rate that you would think, comes in the form of inappropriate parental responses that can come from two possible negative outcomes. So keep this in mind because a lot of times people in life naturally are just going to utilize these terms without even knowing what they mean. So one side of the coin is if somebody is too lenient. The other side of the coin is if somebody is too short or expects too much of them. So let's look at this a little bit closer. So if a parent's approach is too lenient, an anal explosive personality can develop. So an easy way to be able to recognize and apply what is going on in these terms is if we slow it down a little bit. So too lenient is where somebody gives too much grace. So if you think of somebody that's giving too much grace and not paying that much attention, explosive, think of an explosive. So if I were to throw an explosive, things are going to be everywhere. So that's a way that you can be able to recognize and apply, explosive. When you say explosive, think of explosive based on the fact that it's when a person is messy, wasteful, or destructive. And when they are not getting their way, they're easily angered based on the fact that they feel like things could just always be done for them. So if a parent is too lenient, providing little guidance or doing everything for that child is going to learn that they can expect that out of everybody, but the world doesn't work that way. So again, explosive, when they don't get what they want, they're throwing an explosive and everything is everywhere. So if they are messy, a parent may pick up after them. Or if they get something, they may be like, I'm going to be able to get this back later, and they waste it in some way, shape, or form. On the other side of the river, if a parents are too short or begin toilet training too early, an anal retentive personality can develop. And this is the term that I was saying people often use loosely of like, man, that person is so anal. They just like things a particular way. Well, that's what anal retentive is. So if you think of the word retention, they are trying to keep things in order. So if you're trying to retain something, you're trying to keep it a particular way that you want it. So anal retentive is the word the person is stringent, orderly, rigid, and excessively and overly controlling over everything that they are a part of. And that could come from their way of trying to obtain control with their environment where they otherwise didn't have it when they were younger. So anal explosive, think of an explosive again, based on the fact that when they don't get what they want, they're going to be explosive. However, every environment that they are in, it looks like an explosive was thrown as well because they're messy, wasteful, they're destructive, as well as they become easily angered and are ready to blow the top off when they're not getting their way in some way, shape, or form. Anal retentive, on the other hand, is where somebody is trying to retain their sense of being by being stringent, orderly, rigid, excessively, and overly controlling based on the fact when they were younger doing toilet training, they didn't have control within their environment and they were being degraded and demeaned for who they were, even though they were trying their best. So kind of a quick review of the anal stage. Again, when you think of anal, think of the bowels or toilet training based on the fact that this is how a child is learning to be toilet trained, as well as how the parent and or caregivers are coming at it. So the success is dependent on the positive environment that is cultivated by the parent. If they are being rewarded, they're given kind words, even if they're not utilizing it at the appropriate time. It's not like the parent's ready to be an explosive and blow everything up. They're like, okay, everybody makes mistakes. It's okay. You tried your best. How about we try doing this in the future? On the other side of the river, a failure comes when a parent is over the top and is reacting as if it's the end of the world that the child made a mistake in some way, shape, or form. But again, it could be dependent on who is around. So let's say we have one parent that was super kind and caring. On the other hand, we have an explosive parent that if something goes wrong, they're blowing the top off of it. So when the parent that is blowing the top off of it and getting aggressive and angry, that child is going to be more anxious and overwhelmed. When they're in the around the parent that is calm, collected, and positive, but that harsh parent is gone, they're going to feel more open and maybe progress quicker than when they're in that anxious and overwhelmed state. However, if they're in that harsh and overwhelming state for too long, we can have two types of personalities that come up in the forms of a fixation. Anal explosive, think of an explosive, based on the fact that if this individual is in an environment, it looks like an explosive has gone off because they're messy, wasteful, and they're destructive in what they do, but they're easily angered when they're not getting their way. Anal retentive, on the other hand, think of somebody retaining something. They are trying to retain as much control as they possibly can by being overly stringent, orderly, rigid, excessive, and overly controlling based on the fact that they like things a particular way. And anal retentive is the term that people often use loosely and say that person is so anal. They just like things a particular way. However, they're oftentimes referencing Freud, whether they know it or not. The next stage that we'll look at is the phallic stage. So the phallic stage is the next one. So similar to the previous stages, oral, think of mouth, anal, think of butt or toilet training, phallic, key emphasis on feel, because this individual is starting to feel themselves in a sexual manner, not out of a sexual arousal manner, but they're starting to notice that they have body parts in some way, shape, or form. So the phallic stage key emphasis on feel because they're starting to feel their body and discover who they are. And this stage is often from 3 to 6 years old. So within this, and why I'm saying they're feeling themselves is because the primary focus of libido or sexual energy is on the genitals, not in a sexual intercourse manner, but they're starting to notice that they have genitalia. So at this age, children begin to discover the differences between male and female. So boys begin to view their fathers as rivals or competition for their mother's attention. And this term is called the Oedipus complex, which is stated wanting to possess the mother and desire to replace the father. So this is where they start feeling themselves and they're like, hey, what's going on here? I think this person is trying to take the person that I love away from me. A huge extreme example is Norman Bates. So Norman Bates is a person that had an overly affectionate relationship with his mother, ended up killing his mother's boyfriend in order to be with her. She wasn't feeling that idea. He ended up killing her, keeping her body for himself. So that is a huge example of the Oedipus complex, of where a child wants to possess their mother at any cost that they can. So they're trying to replace the father. However, within this situation, the way that this oftentimes stops itself is Freud thought a male child who sees a naked woman for the first time believes that her penis has been cut off. So they're like, oh my gosh, I have this genitalia. My mother does not. What the heck is going on? So then the child fears that his own father will do the same to him for desiring his mother. So this is where the Oedipus complex kind of ends, because a boy is like, man, I really want to be with my mom. She's such a nice person. I love her so much. This guy is starting to take some of the time that I would have. However, within this situation, what tends to reverse this is the fact that the boy's like, oh my gosh, my mom doesn't have this. I have this. My dad has that. He must have harmed my mom. So I have to kind of play it cool so it doesn't hurt me as well, which is coined as castration anxiety. Castration, removing a genitalia body part, anxiety, fear, or excessive worry. So castration anxiety is where somebody has fear or worry that they will be castrated in some way, shape, or form. And it's linked to the Oedipus complex. On the other side of the river, the Electra complex is the female version of the Oedipus complex. So, stated in a different way, it's the female's desire for her father, but she notices that she doesn't have a penis and her father does, which causes her distress. So, similarly to how the Oedipus complex worked itself out, same thing with the Electra complex. The Electra complex is like, man, I want to spend as much time as I can with my father. My mom's starting to get in the way. But then they start noticing that there's difference in genitalia. And then they're like, ah, what the heck is going on? So then the girl starts to resolve her anxiety by repressing the desire for her father and substitute her wish for a penis with a wish for a child to start conforming with her mother for fear that the mother could harm her in some way, shape, or form. So it's the phallic stage, and why I say they're feeling themselves, because they're starting to feel their body, notice that they have genitalia. However, they have these underlining urges for the parent of the opposite sex at that given moment. So, quick review: the Oedipus complex is where a boy wants to possess his mother and wants to eliminate his father. However, that tends to work itself out through castration anxiety, because the boy's like, oh my gosh, my mom doesn't have a penis. I have a penis. My dad has a penis. He's going to hurt me if I express these urges, or if he discovers this is how I am feeling. The Electra complex, on the other hand, is the female version of the Oedipus complex, and it's where the girl desires her father, but notices she doesn't have the same genitalia of the individual that she's desiring. So therefore, she represses her feelings in order to conform with her mother, which she fears will be harmed in some way, shape, or form. And the next stage is going to be the latent stage. And this is where it's going to be a huge spin, because it's not based on pleasure so much. So it's more focused on fitting in with other individuals. So an easy way to be able to recognize and apply the latent stage is key emphasis on late, because if you view yourself as being late to a social event, you're going to be more social and chatty to talk with everyone else to kind of identify what you missed. So the latent stage starts at 6 years old and goes until puberty. But again, there can be fixations and there can be issues with and for the situation. But we'll get into that at the tail end of the description of the latent stage. So the latent stage, key emphasis on late, because somebody feels like they're late to the party. So all of their energy is focusing on socializing and developing social relationships. So this is where the superego continues to develop. And again, we'll go through the differences between id, ego, and superego in just a little bit. So the superego continues to develop while the id's energies are suppressed. So again, ids are going to be impulsive decision making. So those are going to be suppressed, and we're going to be more focused on developing relationships with other individuals. So this is where children begin to develop social skills, values, and relationships with peers, as well as adults outside of their own family. So this is where there's going to be some prioritizing on developing social relationships. So this is where the development of the ego and superego contribute to the latent stage period of calm, because the ego is going to be in the middle and kind of suppress or work through some of the id's impulsive decision making, while the superego is more focused on developing relationships and staying within the morals of society. So this stage involves the child entering school, social interactions, and they become more concerned with their ability to fit into social groups than prior stages, based on the fact we need to start developing relationships based on similar interests. So the latent period is a time of exploration in which sexual energy is repressed and dormant. So it's not active and it's not revved like a small engine. So the latent stage, key emphasis on late, because if you feel like you're a late bloomer or you're late to the party, you're going to start communicating more so than you would have prior to the earlier stages. So this is where the main conflict here is going to be the development of a social network or peer group to start gaining a sense of self. Because again, each stage has these fixations that must be worked through or key milestones that must be accomplished. In the oral, it was the weaning process. The anal stage was the toilet training, and the phallic was starting to identify and create a sense of what their body is like. And this, we're going to start developing a sense of social network. So a fixation here, or where you're not accomplishing developing that social network, is where immaturity and an inability to form lasting, fulfilling relationships as an adult would continue. And this would happen when somebody is rejected or too anxious to try new things. Thus, they are isolated from building relationships or experiencing rejection in a healthy manner, because rejection is something that everybody is going to experience. It's just a matter of the reaction that they have to the rejection that makes the result of what they're going through. So again, if somebody in the anal stage was hyper focused on or anxiously driven and demeaned, them going into the latent stage, they may feel like they don't fit in with everyone else, or if they make one mistake, that everybody is going to leave them in some way, shape, or form. So that's the key thing here, is how all the stages kind of carry into this is the reaction to stress or how focused the parents were on the children. So quick review of the latent stage, key emphasis on late. So if you view somebody being late, they're more likely to communicate with other individuals because they want to socialize in some way, shape, or form. However, again, depending on who the person is or their personality style, they may not be willing to communicate with people for fear that they might be rejected. The ideal is that somebody starts to develop a social network or peer group that they can be themselves and get acceptance in some way, shape, or form. And the last stage of the psychosexual stages of development is going to be the genital stage. And again, everything that has been suppressed or stopped at some point in time is going to become hyperactive and revved up like a small engine. So the genital stage, key emphasis on genital, think of the genitalia again. This is going to start at puberty and go until death. So this is where all of that libido that was suppressed in the latent stage is now going to become hyperactive and revved up like a small engine that's about to explode, because the onset of puberty causes the libido to become active and hyperactive at sometimes and revved up. So the individual develops a sense of self, of sexual interest in the opposite sex and or the same sex, depending on how they're identifying or the urges that they're feeling inside of their body. So where in earlier stages, the sexual energy was solely individual focused to get their needs and or interests met, in the oral stage, it was simply to survive. The anal stage was around toilet training and developing a relationship with a parent based on the feedback that they provide. The phallic stage was more focused on feeling themselves and identifying who they are. The latent stage, all of that energy was focused on establishing relationships and getting their needs met. So now the focus is on a sense of connection with the welfare of others and their well-being within this situation. So if there was a success in previous stages, somebody would be well balanced and have a sense of connection within their social network. Because again, The latent stage is more focused on developing that social network and getting some satisfaction in some way, shape, or form. So the main conflict here is to establish a balance between the various areas of life. Because if you're too focused in one area, it's going to be unbalanced, and all of these different urges and things are going to be unsatisfied because you cannot 100% live in impulsive decision making or pleasure centers in some way, shape, or form. So, this is where Freud believed that the ego and superego were formed and functioning at this point. And if you haven't picked up on it already, the impulsive decision making is going to be 100% attributable to the id. So the ego and superego, their job is going to be kind of combating some of that impulsive decision making or that impulsive energy to allow for somebody to function in a better manner than they would if they did not have an ego or super ego. So, kind of a quick review of the genital stage. This is where somebody is going to start developing sexual relationships with the opposite sex or the same sex, depending on how they identify. They're also going to try to find a balance in their life between relationships, career, and who they are as an individual, while also satisfying and continuing on to develop relationships and to create a next generation or impact the next generation in some way, shape, or form. So, those are the stages of these psychosexual stages of development. Let's segue now into the psychoanalytic theory. So, this is going to start off with the three levels of the mind: conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, and then go into the three components of personality. So, psychoanalytic theory is where a client is seen as a product of their past, and treatment with this individual involves dealing with the repressed material in the unconscious. So, personality arises because of attempts to resolve conflicts between the unconscious, sexual and aggressive impulses, and societal demands to restrain or keep things in wraps, or to avoid being 100% impulsive with the decision making. And that's where the components of personality are going to come in. However, let's examine the three levels of the mind before we get into that. So, the first level of the mind is going to be the conscience. So, this is where you will have a conscious mind within the situation. So, conscious is where you are going to have different thoughts in your focus that you can easily focus on at any given moment. So if you think of somebody that is conscious, they're awake and they're aware of everything that is going on around them. So this consists of the thoughts that you're focusing on right now, or the sensations that you're experiencing directly in this moment. So this is all of the information that a client is able to pay attention to at any given moment. So it's the thoughts that they're experiencing, the perceptions or perspectives that they have, the sensations on their body, or different noises and sounds around them. However, with this, if you are conscious to all these different things, it's going to be a small amount of information that you know about and you're able to focus on at any given moment. So, for example, if the room that you're in is warm or it's cold, or you're like, man, this session is really, really helpful right now, or man, this session is not as helpful as I thought it would be, or holy smokes, these components make a lot more sense. It's something that you can easily experience or bring out of your mind relatively easily. Another example, I'm going to be hanging out with my friend tonight and I'm excited. So it's not super far out of your mind where you forget that you're hanging out with a friend. Because again, it's easily tapped into if it's something that you're excited. So it's something that you have on your mind that you can easily think about. So an easy way to be able to think about the conscience level of the mind is that you're awake and fully functioning. Because if somebody is conscious, they are able to be aware of what's going on. When they're unconscious, they're asleep and they're not functioning at the best way that they can. So conscience is whatever you are able to interact with around you at this given moment. The next level of the mind is going to be pre-conscious. So if you think about it, pre is prior. So this is before somebody's able to be conscious of what is going on within their situation. So stated in a different way, it's all the information outside of a client's attention, but it's readily available if needed. So it's not something that's always going to be on somebody's mind, but it's not super difficult for them to identify it if they need it. So preconscious is it's prior to being on their mind, but it's easily accessible. So these could be somebody's thoughts and feelings that can be brought to the consciousness relatively quickly. So things that could be aware of if we needed to, or if we try to at some capacity. So these are things that you may have in your memory, but you're not constantly thinking about them. So, for example, my best friend's phone number. And again, with cell phones, it's a lot more difficult to identify numbers, but I remember where I can access that number if I need to. But I'm not constantly thinking about that number over and over and over and over and over. Another example is how to change a tire. Well, oftentimes you're not going to be thinking about how to change a tire until your tire goes out. However, if you've done it a decent amount of times, it's going to come back to your memory relatively easily, but it's not on your mind unless you have hell anxiety when you're driving a car of like, I need to learn how to change a tire. I need to go through that process as I'm doing it. But hopefully you're still able to think about driving as you're doing that. So these are memories or stored pieces of knowledge that you can access if you needed to, but if not, it's not going to come up. So, an easy way to be able to recognize and apply this stage is that you're not awake, but with some effort, this piece of information can be woken up. So, conscious is what is awake and fully functioning at that given moment. Preconscious is prior to being awake and fully functional, but with some prompting, you could get somebody awake. It'd be like if somebody was napping on the couch and you nudge them. It may not be an exciting news, but you would be able to wake them up at some capacity. Conscious would be if I tried waking somebody up that was already awake. They'd be like, why do you think I'm sleeping? I'm fully aware and functioning. Preconscious would be like, I'm not awake, but if you need me, you can wake me up relatively easily. Unconscious, on the other hand, so think of they are under a spell or under the level of functioning that somebody's able to be conscious of. And this is oftentimes going to be where a lot of what we're working with individuals on comes from. So the unconscious level of the mind is thoughts, feelings, desires, and memories of which individuals have no awareness of, but they can influence every aspect of their day-to-day life. And as we go through the defense mechanisms, this is going to be the repression defense mechanism related to this. So it's things that we are not fully aware of, but it would take great deals of effort to become aware of them in some way, shape, or form. So these aren't things that I can be like, oh, yeah, man, what's my best friend's phone number? It'd be, man, I oftentimes want to people please individuals, but I'm not really sure where that tendency comes from. But then you find out that you've always had to help other individuals at the expense of yourself. Another way to look at it is these are the things that are often too frightening or painful for somebody to acknowledge. So if you had these traumas or all these distressing thoughts on your mind 100% of your days, it is oftentimes going to be immobilizing and it's not going to allow for you to function in the best way that you can. So a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further: not wanting to be around dogs and not knowing why. However, when this individual was a child, they were attacked and they do not remember. So not wanting to be around dogs. However, when they were a child, they were attacked, but they do not remember. They're just afraid of dogs and like, gosh, man, dogs are so frightening, but they can't pull that memory out based on the fact that it might have been too young or it's too distressing for that individual to experience. Another example: when you think about the exam, you picture that you failed and it makes you anxious, but you prefer not to think about it. So you're not able to learn from it. So if this is a distressing memory, if somebody fails the exam, they're often times not going to think about it, or it's too difficult to stressful for them to think about it. So their mind has checked out that 4 hours, or if they had accommodations longer, when they were going through it. And this is often linked to a trauma based on the fact that the mind is so intelligent that it's trying to protect somebody from pain at all expenses. So, another way to think about it is this is the level of the mind that is sleeping. So, it has no idea what's going on around it. So, this is the level of the mind that most people are sleeping to, and they're not really conscious of, or they're not easily able to access those memories based on the traumas that were linked to those memories. So, a quick review of the levels of the mind. Conscious is the things that you are aware of in your environment or that you can easily describe in some way, shape, or form. Preconscious is what is prior to your awareness. However, if you tried and you thought about it, you would be able to access those memories when you need to. And then unconscious, key emphasis on un, because it's under the radar and you're unaware of what's going on around you based on a trauma that was linked to that memory that you're no longer able to access. And I stated it before, but this is going to be associated to the defense mechanism of repression. Your mind has pressed it out of possibilities to protect you in some way, shape, or form. Now, let's get into the three components of personality based on the fact that this is going to be the driving forces behind a lot of the things that Freud was discussing, as well as the defense mechanisms that we will get into in just a little bit. The first one up to bat is going to be id. The easiest way to be able to recognize and apply id is by breaking the name down by each letter. So I equals impulsive, D equals decision making. So the id is impulsive decision making. So all of the impulsive moves that somebody does or all the urges that somebody experiences, the driving force behind it is going to be the id. Stated in a different way, it operates at an unconscious level according to the pleasure principle. So if you think of a pleasure principle, it's going to have the driving thoughts of I want, I'm going to do it, or I'm going to have an impulsive decision and I'll think about the consequences later. So the id demands immediate satisfaction of the most basic needs and wants, which are the impulsive demands. So it's the impulsive actions and or ideas that are the main driving factors behind this. And a lot of times people will get the id, ego, and super ego mixed up. However, the best example that I can give is think of a cartoon where you had the angel and the devil and the character all involved in the scene. So let's say Tom and Jerry. Let's say we have the devil, we have the angel, and then we have Tom that is in the situation. So the id is going to be the devil that's like, come on, man, it's not that big of a deal. It doesn't matter if you harm anybody. It's not that crazy. And then the other components, as we go through it, I'll describe those characters as well. So the id is that devil or villain on the shoulder. So this is where instant gratification is going to come about. And this is where you need to satisfy those needs. So your id is going to be like, boom, we'll do it and think about the consequences later. So it's instinctual energy that contains biological urges such as impulse towards survival, sex, and aggression. The id is present at birth. And again, if we think of the psychosexual stages of development, the oral stage is 100% linked to survival as well as pleasure. So that's where the id comes in. So there are two different urges related to the id. There is the survival urges as well as the destructive urges. So the survival urges helps the person to survive, directs life-sustaining activities such as breathing, eating, and sex. And sex in this component is going to be for creating children and continuing on the species. So energy created here is the libido or sexual energy. So these urges are essential for sustaining life of the individual as well as the continuation of the species. So procreation, thirst, hunger, and pain avoidance in some way, shape, or form. So again, survival urges, think of somebody wanting to survive. We will survive. Destructive urges, on the other hand, think of destruction. This is a set of destructive forces present in all human beings. So when the energy is directed outwards, it's viewed as aggression or violence. When the destructive urges are directed inward, it is self harm. So, this is where a person has an unconscious desire to die, but the life instinct or the survival urges largely repels this urge. For example, people with trauma or abuse histories tend to reenact past experiences or get into future abusive relationships without realizing it, based on the fact that the destructive urges are telling them that it is a good idea within the situation. Because we tend to do the things that feel good, or we tend to forget the things that are not so negative within our situation, or we view them as they're not as bad as they actually were. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. A baby will cry to get their needs met, and a young child will have a fit to get something that they want. That is going to be their impulsive decision making of it's about me and I do not care about anyone else within the situation. Another example, someone eats a donut at work, even though they may be on a diet. Again, that it is like, man, it's not that big of a deal. One donut's not going to hurt, but then one donut could lead to multiple donuts, which could mess up the person's diet in general. Another example, a teenager wants a pair of shoes that they cannot afford. Instead of saving money for them, they steal them. Again, that it is in their mind that's like, you can't wait. It's not that big of a deal. People steal all the time. You're not going to get caught. Nobody gets caught stealing shoes. That company makes billions of dollars. You stealing one pair of shoes is not that big of a deal. Another example, someone fails their ASWB exam, and instead of reflecting on their process and what needs they have, they go buy more materials because it's too painful for them to work with what they have. And they're filling that pleasure center with more and more and more, when oftentimes when it comes to studying, less is more, and focusing on your needs and how you learn is going to be the pivotal moment of how you go into the exam to kick it directly in the chest to get the job done. So when you think of the ID, think of impulsive decision making. And now think back to that cartoon. So we have the devil on the shoulder. So the character or the person or human is going to be the ego. And why? Because an easy way to be able to recognize and apply the ego is going to be E equals evaluate, and then go is the action that you're going to make after you have evaluated all the different circumstances within the situation. So the ego is where you're going to evaluate both the devil or the id and the angel or the super ego on your shoulders. So two ways to be able to recognize it. E equals evaluate before you go. Ego, evaluate, and then go, or let it go. So you have to let the impulsive decision making things go. So shout out to Frozen, because we're going to let it go and we're going to survive and strive on the things that we particularly need to do. So you have to let the impulsive decision making go and focus on the actions and things that can help you in some way, shape, or form. So again, two ways. Ego is evaluate before going, or let it go, based on the fact that we need to do what we need to do within the situation. So the ego is the component that manages the conflict between the id, again, ID, impulsive decision making, and the constraints of the real world. Because you cannot 100% of your days be doing impulsive things or destructive things and sustain that over time. So the ego is the middle ground between the id, the impulsive decision making, and super ego, or the superhero mentality of where you're trying to rescue everybody. So the ego's goal is to satisfy the needs and demands of the id while also balancing the demands of the real world. So some of the components of the ego are unconscious, where others are preconscious or conscious, depending on the situation that the person is in. So the ego operates on the reality principle, when the id was operating on the pleasure principle of I need everything that I need for me, regardless of the consequences. While the ego is living more in reality and has the awareness that gratification has to be delayed sometimes in order to accommodate the demands of the real world. So if I want a pair of shoes, even though I may want to steal them, I have to think in my mind, is stealing these shoes worth the potential consequences? Or do I have to have patience within my situation, save my money, and then buy the shoes at some time later in the future? So the ego's role is to prevent the id from gratifying its impulses in socially inappropriate ways. So that's the thing. The ego has a difficult job of combating the impulsive decision making while also balancing the demands of the world in general. So there are two types of ego reactions when it comes to balancing the demands of the world. There's ego syntonic and ego dystonic. So an easy way to be able to recognize and apply them or compare them to one another is if we look at the words. So ego syntonic, if you look closely, it almost spells the word sync, because ego syntonic reactions are behaviors that are in sync, not the singing group, but that are paralleled to what is socially acceptable. So these are socially acceptable actions based on the ego. So if somebody does ego syntonic behaviors, this is where somebody is guilt free because the ego is comfortable with the decision. So, for example, let's go back to the shoe example of you have to make a decision. You have the devil on your shoulder that's like, come on, Phil, it's not that big of a deal. And then you have the super ego on the other hand that's being like, man, you really shouldn't do it. Think about how everyone's going to judge you. People that steal are bad people. And then if I walk away and don't steal it, but come up with a plan on how I can get the shoes in the future, that's going to be ego syntonic because it's in sync with what is societally acceptable of not stealing. Ego dystonic, because we're not all saints and we can sometimes make mistakes. Ego dystonic, so if you look at it, it spells the word dissync, because these behaviors are dissync or against what is societally acceptable within the situation. So the behaviors are either in sync or aligned with what society wants you to do, or dissync or out of sync of what you would particularly think. So this is where some experiences create guilt because the ego is bothered or uncomfortable with the specific behavior or multiple behaviors that somebody has exhibited. So this could be, let's say, we go back to the shoe example of you're starting to devise a plan of like, man, should I steal it or should I not steal it? You steal the shoes. And then afterwards, you have that pit in your stomach that's like, man, I really shouldn't have done that. And now what does this do? Because now every time that you go around that store, you're going to think, man, are they really on to me? Or, man, do they really know that I stole? Or, man, how did me stealing these pairs of shoes take these away from somebody that was actually going to get them and would be excited in some way, shape, or form? So this is where that conscience in your mind is always telling you like, man, you shouldn't have done that. I can't believe it. So it's like that burning of the neck feeling, if you will. But it's not the only thing that's going to be related to decisions that are made by the ego. So there is this concept called ego strength. So the concept ego strength is the ability of the ego to effectively deal with the demands of the id, itself, the ego, and superego, as well as reality. So ego strength is when you have experience, you are going to be more experienced in making decisions that are going to align with what you think is appropriate. However, too much ego strength leads to rigidity or stubborn behavior of where you never never try to get pleasure for yourself in any way, shape, or form. So, for example, let's say you're like, you know what? I'm going to say so focused on this goal, which could be asceticism, and we'll get into that in a little bit, where you delay pleasure for to accomplish a particular goal. But too much of this could be like, I'm never spending money on myself. So you have clothes that have holes in them, your shoes are starting to grow roots and you're about to fall outside of them. That would be too much ego strength of like, I'm never, ever, ever, ever going to step outside and allow for the id to get anything that it wants. However, too much of a good thing could be a bad thing. However, too little control would be too little ego strength. So, too little ego strength leads to feeling torn or flippant when placed in a decision making process. So, what this looks like is you're like, I'm not really sure what to do. So, too much of it is like, I know exactly what I'm going to particularly do. Too little is like, oh my God, somebody tell me what I need to do because I'm not really sure what I particularly could do. Or you're so impulsive that you're making these decisions without any considerations of the consequences in any way, shape, or form. So, too much is not good. Too little is not good either. So, a couple of examples of what this could look like. A teenager realizes he doesn't have enough money to buy a desired item, so he buys a cheaper alternative. So, that would be a good balance in between the id of wanting that expensive item, but not suppressing it so much where they're not going to satisfy any of their needs. They still were able to get an alternative thing to satisfy that urge in some way. Another example, a person sees donuts in the break room at work and decides whether they want to stick with their diet or eat one. So that's the thing. The id is like, man, just eat the donut. Not a big deal. You might even be able to take two because you might be hungry by the time you get back to your desk. Or, man, you know that you get hungry later on. So why not take two? While the super ego is like, man, you shouldn't have been the one that bought the donuts. Or, man, you should stick to your diet because of all of these different reasons. So this is where the ego tries to find a balance between too much rigidity or too little rigidity in some way. So this person may eat a small piece of a donut or have a healthy snack to fit into their diet, but still satisfy their urge in a way that represents them still getting pleasure in some way, shape, or form. Too much ego strength would have been like, I'm just not going to eat for the rest of the day if I ate that donut. Or too little is like, you know what? I'm just going to eat this whole box and we'll talk about the diet a little bit later on. A balance is either a small piece of the donut to still give yourself some of what you want, or another alternative to it that was still satisfying for you in some way, shape, or form. And now, segueing into the last component of personality. So think back to that cartoon of the id, impulsive decision making. That's the devil on the shoulder. The ego is the human or the character in the show, while the super ego, on the other hand, is going to be that angel that's trying to satisfy the needs of every single person and try to better society as a whole. So, what I often recommend people to conceptualize is that super ego, key emphasis on super, think of a superhero. Because a superhero is trying to rescue everybody else at the expense of themselves. So, the id is the devil on the shoulder that never thinks of anybody but themselves. The ego is trying to balance the demands of the id while also staying connected to society and keeping in mind the super ego component. So the super ego is telling the ego to help influence and combat the id. You can't have that right now. So it tries to save the morale and values of the person because of the id can cause somebody to do something that they would not have otherwise done. So think of a superhero. The super ego is trying to protect the person from harm. So this is the moral component of personality, as it contains all the moral standards learned from the parents in society in general. Because again, the ego is trying to balance the id, impulsive decision making, and the demands of the reality while staying true to the morals and values that have been implanted inside of the person. So it attempts to serve the best interest of others and finds it difficult to think of oneself. So, too far on superego, and you're giving all of your energy and time and resources away and never trying to better yourself in any way, shape, or form. So, it forces the ego to conform not only to reality, but the ideas of morality. So, it's like, man, not just how do you satisfy your needs, but avoid hurting other people, but how do you start giving away some of your belongings or resources to other people to help building them up? So, hence, it causes individuals to feel guilty when they go against society's rules. So, it operates on the morality principle. So, the id was on the pleasure principle of 100% just trying to satisfy the pleasure of the individual. The ego was on the reality principle of just trying to balance all of the needs and stay within reality. The superego, think of a superhero, they're trying to operate on the morals or the morality principle. So that this is the gauge of right and wrong that are accepted by an individual or group influenced by their parents and society. So this is where they're taking in the considerations of every individual, but also trying to set somebody up to be a good individual or influencer for other people to come after them. So the superego is made up of the conscience given to a person by their parents or a caregiver and society indicating what is right and wrong, which is considered the ego ideal. So it's the ideal situation if somebody was living the life that they were told was important to live. So let's look at this a little bit closer to see what we're looking at and how each of these terms tie together, because there's the ego ideal as well as the conscience within the situation. Again, the conscience is what was given to somebody by their family or society, while the ego ideal is what this superego is telling the individual what is important. So the ego ideal, key emphasis on the ideal, because this person is living the ideal situation based on what they've been told. So ego ideal is the idea that people have of what they should be like given by their parents or society. So what is the ideal situation or what has been prescribed to this person? So a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. Everyone in your family is a lawyer, so you feel like you need to become one. So that's the prescribed role that if you're not a lawyer, that you're less than within the situation, because everyone in your family is demanding this out of you. So that's the ideal situation for you. Another example, if everyone at your job passes their ASWB exam on the first try, you feel like you have to as well. So if everyone has done that as well, so you feel like you have to. So if everyone at your job passes it on the first try, so you feel like you have to pass it as well. It's the ideal situation of how you can still fit in and morph and become a member of that ideal society. On the other side of the river, the conscience is our view of what is considered wrong. So you can think of it as an internal set of rules. So it's trying to balance what society is demanding out of somebody while also trying to keep in mind what rules are considered important for that individual. So when we break outside of the rules that we have inside of our mind, which creates that burden of the neck feeling, the superego considers our behavior to be bad. So this can lead us to having feelings of guilt or remorse. So if you've wronged done somebody, your conscience is going to tell you, hey, you should probably apologize based on the fact that that wasn't a good thing that you should have done. So this information is going to be viewed as bad by our parents or society. So we are trying to avoid judgment from the group of people that we want acceptance from. And these behaviors are often forbidden and lead to bad consequences, punishments, or feelings of guilt or remorse in some way, shape, or form. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. If you were utilizing substances in an environment or family where substance use is kind of demonized or not done, you may feel outside of the norm and feel guilt or remorse based on the fact that you're utilizing substances. Premarital sex when you're in a religious family, failing the exam, missing social events, getting a different degree than your family told you that you should be getting, etc., because you're not in the ideal situation of what they told you. Because if you think about it, it's going against what that person told you. But the conscience is not what they're telling you to do. It's just what you have developed in your mind based on the feedback of what other people have told you, because that's the competing forces between ego ideal and conscience. Because ego ideal is what is the ideal situation that is being prescribed to you, while your conscience is what you have derived from what people have told you. And it's kind of like your compass of what is good, what is bad, what is tolerable, and what is intolerable or intolerable within this situation. So again, the superego is going to be where you're trying to be a superhero and trying to sustain the name that your family has or the society that you live in has by prescribing an ideal role of what you should do, while also having this competing force of what your conscience is telling you that is right and wrong. So kind of a quick review of the three components of personality. The ID is impulsive decision making, because this is where your mind or personality is trying to live on the pleasure principle of accomplishing all the different things that could give you pleasure. While the ego, on the other hand, is trying to balance the demands of the id or impulsive decision making, as well as the demands of society or reality, as well as your ideal compass within your mind that you've learned from your environment. So, impulsive decision making, ID, the id, ego, E, evaluate before go or let it go, is going to identify what you particularly are going to be doing based on weighing on a scale what is more important to you at that given moment. So ego syntonic is where you're in sync with what your environment or what you think is appropriate. Ego dystonic is where you're dissync or outside of what you deem important. And then the ego strength is how strong of a resistance do you have to the impulsive decision making things that you have. Too much, then you're never doing anything that drives pleasure, and too little, and you're focusing too much on accomplishing pleasure achieving activities. Super ego is where you feel like you have to be a superhero and navigate life to fit the ideal roles that people in your particular group have deemed appropriate. The id, impulsive decision making, lives on the pleasure principle. The ego is in the reality principle, while superego is on the morality principle of thinking, how are you being moral and what morals do you assign yourself to, while also fighting in between the ego ideal, what is the ideal role or vision that people have for you, while also balancing the conscience of what your view and balancing all of these different things, your moral compass of what is right versus what is wrong. Again, thinking back to that cartoon character, the id is the devil on the shoulder. The ego is the character or cartoon, and the superego is the angel on the shoulder. So those are easy ways to be able to recognize and apply the concepts related to ego, id, and superego, as well as the stages of psychosocial development. And how we tie this all together is going to be the defense mechanisms, because the defense mechanisms are going to be ways in order to protect us from harm from society or from our own internal workings. Let's segue now into the defense mechanisms to see how they try to protect the person from harm. So, the defense mechanisms overall are psychological strategies that are unconsciously used to protect a person from anxiety arising from unacceptable thoughts or behaviors. And as we go through each level of the defense mechanisms, it's going to start to become more conscious, but somebody may not be aware of the things that they are doing until somebody identifies it for them. So, overall, the defense mechanisms are unconsciously being employed by the person's mind. So they are used to protect from fears as well as perceived harm. Key emphasis on perceived harm, because somebody does not actually have to be harmed at a given moment for their mind to start trying to protect it in some way, shape, or form. So it can not just be based on fears, but things that the mind thinks are going to come up. So the different driving forces are going to be the id, ego, and superego in their competing battles in between one another, as well as with society. Again, id, id, impulsive decision making, ego, E equals evaluate, and then you go or just let it go. And then super ego is where you attempt to be a superhero and uphold the morals of society. So they are also automatic, involuntary, and usually unconscious reactions to exclude unacceptable thoughts, urges, threats, and impulses from the awareness of fear, disapproval, punishment, or other negative consequences. And that's the key thing, is they are usually unconscious. But as we get into the mature defense mechanisms, you'll understand why it's usually unconscious and not 100% always unconscious. So the first level of defense mechanism that we will look at is going to be the primitive defense mechanisms. So key emphasis on prime. So think of prime, think of a primate. That is where they are going to be more of primal instincts within the situation. So primitive defense mechanisms are more primate type reactions. So they are often predicated on a mistake or inaccurate representation of social reality. So think of a primate, think of somebody that's not able to operate within normal society. So think of a primate, think of an ape, they're not able to react to what conscious thoughts or society rules are demanding of them. So we work to avoid short-term pain. Generally, this does not result in constructive outcomes. So the primitive defense mechanisms are just to alleviate short-term pain, but they often cause long-term consequences. So they are not much help for people looking for actual ways to solve problems. And they are often first learned during childhood and may persist into adulthood or as somebody is an adult if they were harmed in a significant way during their childhood. Because trauma and substance use are things that can delay someone's development in the way that somebody behaved when that trauma began or when they started utilizing substances could also equate to how they will respond as an adult. So let's go through the primitive defense mechanisms right now, and they are as follows. So the first one up to bat is going to be denial. Key emphasis on deny, because this is where somebody is going to outright deny that something is true, or they are going to not take the consequences or assign blame to themselves. Stated in a different way, it involves blocking external events from their awareness. Because if you're not thinking about something, you're just going to deny that it actually exists, out of sight, out of mind. So if somebody is in a situation and it is too much for them to handle, they will refuse to experience it or just entirely check out from that situation. So, stated in a different way, it could be outright refusal to admit or recognize something has occurred or is currently happening in some way, shape, or form. Because again, if you're not putting focus on something, you may not actually fully understand or even want to fully understand the capacity of what is actually happening or the magnitude of the impacts of your behaviors or the behaviors of other individuals. So, this is where a person may accept responsibility yet minimize the impact. So, if they do acknowledge that they've done something, they are going to downplay the impact that it has based on the fact that they do not want to acknowledge the negative consequences of a particular behavior. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. Someone who smokes cigarettes may refuse to admit that smoking is bad for their health by citing random facts to back it up. Somebody's like, man, smoking's going to kill you. You're really smoking those cancer sticks. My grandfather lived to 90 and he smoked. So what's the big deal? Smoking is not a big problem. Everybody smokes. Another example, a person is unable to pick up on subtle signs that his relationship is over or may minimize his feelings after it has ended. Somebody's like, man, I think that Becca no longer wants to be with me. Oh no, she she totally wants to be with me. Or somebody's like, hey, our relationship is over, and they're like, all right, I'll be over later. I'll bring some food. Hopefully you're hungry. Completely denying the fact that the relationship is over. Another example, failing the ASWB exam and saying the exam wasn't even that hard. I just didn't even try. If I would have given 100% to this exam, I would have just ripped its neck right off of its body, but I didn't try. So it's not that big of a deal. So it's denying the significance of the event to the individual because it's too painful to process what is currently going on. So denial is where somebody actively denies that something is existing or they refuse to experience what emotional things that they're experiencing related to an event. The next one up to bat is going to be reaction formation. So, reaction formation, key emphasis on react, because this is where somebody is going to be reacting in a different or opposite emotional formation than how they actually feel. So, a lot of times, people are going to get reaction formation, sublimation, projection, all mixed up based on the fact that they look rather similar. However, the key component here is reaction formation is where somebody is going to react in the opposite emotional formation than they actually feel. Stated in a different way, unacceptable feelings are expressed as the opposite. So it's taking up opposite feelings, impulses, or behaviors to avoid social consequences in some way, shape, or form. This one is often equated to being passive aggressive. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. A woman who is dissatisfied with her boss compliments her boss on a job well done. If you notice, they have disdain in wanting to yell at this boss, but they're like, I think you're the best boss I've ever had. But again, their internal processing is different and they're acting out their emotions in the total opposite formation than what you would expect. Another example, a boy likes a girl, yet ignores her and acts uninterested when she's around. You would expect if somebody likes somebody to do kind things and be nice to them. However, this boy is ignoring them as well as being rude and demeaning to this girl. Another example, a man is angry at his brother and wants to kill him. Instead, he hugs him. Not a bear hug, not to asphyxiate him, not to choke him out, but genuinely hugs him, even though their internal thoughts are to kill him. Another example, someone is nervous to take their ASWB exam and they tell everybody they're excited and have no doubt that they will pass this exam. So internally, they're freaking out and being like, man, I'm not sure if I can actually do this. But externally, they're like, this is the greatest thing ever. I'm going to go in there and punch it directly in the chest to get the job done. But again, they're reacting and acting out the opposite emotions than they actually experience inside of them. The next defense mechanism up to bat is going to be projection. So, key emphasis on project. So, when you see the word project, think of a projector because somebody has a projector on their chest and they're putting their experience onto somebody else. So, think of the Iron Man suit of the circle that has the beam of light shooting out of it. That Iron Man suit is a projector, and you're putting your thoughts, experiences, and feelings onto somebody else and acting as if they are actually real. So you're trying to propel things away from you. So, stated in a different way, it's attributing one's unacceptable behaviors, thoughts, and feelings onto somebody else. Projecting, you are putting your own actions and thoughts onto somebody else. So projection, you project your things onto somebody else. So a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further: feeling overwhelmed and saying, dang, it looks like Kim is overwhelmed. Because if you're in a work environment and everybody is kind of doing grind culture of like, you need to work as hard as you possibly can until you fall out, you don't want to be like, man, I'm super overwhelmed, I'm feeling behind. So you start saying that other people are overwhelmed and behind to see if the environment will acknowledge, like, yeah, man, it's really tough right now. And you're like, man, I'm feeling overwhelmed as well. But if they don't, you're just like, man, Kim is overwhelmed or she's not doing everything that she possibly can, when those are your actual thoughts and what you may be actually doing. Another example: you hate someone and say, geez, this person just doesn't like me. No matter what I do, Phil just doesn't like me. But at the end of the day, it's because you don't like that individual and you're kind of creating an excuse for why they may not like you, even though you may be doing things that could cause them to dislike you. Another example: cheating on a significant other and accusing them of the behavior when you are the one who is actually cheating. Again, you're putting your behavior of cheating onto your partner and acting as if it is real. Projection: think of a projector on somebody's chest and you are putting out that behavior or thought onto somebody else. The next defense mechanism up to bat is acting out. So key emphasis on act, because this is where somebody is going to act out the emotions that they have. So they're putting actions into play rather than feeling their emotions. So acting out is where the individual copes with stress by engaging in actions rather than reflecting on their internal feelings, because feelings are too painful for them. They're just going to put forth actions in order to express the emotions that they're feeling. So a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further: someone may attempt suicide for people to show concern. They don't vocalize the pain or emotions they're experiencing. They just attempt suicide to show everybody the pain that they are experiencing. Another example: a child may skip school to show they hate school. They're not verbalizing that they hate school. They're just showing it by just not showing up. Another example: Phil avoids his boss to show he hates his job. Another example: I failed my exam, and instead of talking about it, I buy another program to study with because I would rather put forth actions and convince myself the more actions and energy I put into something, the more results that I'll get out, versus me acknowledging what I went through and the pain that I'm experiencing. The next defense mechanism up to bat is going to be regression. Key emphasis on regress, not to get it mistaken for another defense mechanism that we'll go over in just a little bit: repress. Regress, think of the word regress, it means to go back. So regress or regression is when confronted with an undesirable situation, the person copes by reverting back or regressing back to patterns of behavior used in earlier developmentally appropriate manners. So a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further: after the divorce of his parents, a 10-year-old wets his bed. You wouldn't expect a 10-year-old to wet their bed because let's say they weren't wetting their bed and then this divorce occurred and then they go back to wetting their bed. Whether they were wetting the bed before, they weren't, unless they were younger. Another example, someone is sick and will cling to their mother, such as a baby would, based on the fact they're looking for that comfort from their mother. In the last example, someone is stressed out at work and begins sucking their thumb. You wouldn't expect somebody to be sucking their thumb, but regression is where you go back to what was a previously appropriately developmental coping skill, but it's coming back out of nowhere. The next level of defense mechanisms is going to be less primitive. So primitive, key emphasis on primate, because you operate as if you are a primate and oftentimes are not operating based in reality. Less primitive is where you are less primal, but still are ambivalent with your relationship with reality, because it's easier for you to deny reality than to acknowledge it. However, reality is acknowledged here to a larger extent, even if it is put off or avoided in some way. So these defense mechanisms often are going to be mistaken for other ones. So as we're going through these, I'm going to be drawing the parallel in between the ones that people often make mistakes on. So let's start with the first one up to bat is going to be repression. So key emphasis on press, because this is where somebody is going to press down memories or emotions outside of their mind because they are too painful. So if you remember back to the levels of the mind, this is going to be the unconscious part of the mind of where you're not readily able to identify memories because it is too painful for you to acknowledge them. So the ego is going to push them outside of what you actually remember. Not to mistake it for regression, because remember, regress is where you go back to a previously developmentally acceptable behavior, while repression is where your mind is pressing down distressing memories. Stated in a different way, it's an unconscious defense mechanism employed by the ego to keep disturbing or threatening thoughts from being conscious. Again, it's living in the unconscious level of the mind. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. Someone who has a severe childhood abuse history may repress these memories and have a difficult time forming relationships later on and not understand why. So, if they found it difficult to maintain and sustain relationships when they were growing up, where they didn't really feel connected with the other family members in their family, but they are not understanding why they're disconnected from other people or not being connected to people in some way, shape, or form, their mind may have repressed or pressed down those memories. Another example, a young child exhibits repression when they are afraid of dogs, but cannot remember any experiences that would make it so. But again, if a young child was attacked by a dog when they were younger, but are still afraid of a dog and don't understand why, that could be an act of repression. Another example, someone is nervous when taking exams, but does not remember being made fun of during school, yet still beats themselves up for not knowing things or getting nervous during exams. So, again, let's say they were taking an exam, a teacher was like, "You're stupid, you're never going to amount to anything." And they kind of repress that down in their mind, but they're still acting out the behaviors associated with that distressing memory without actually remembering why what they're experiencing actually exists. So repression is where your mind has pressed down distressing memories or experiences in some way, shape, or form. Not to mistake it for regression, where somebody is going back to or regressing to a previously developmentally appropriate behavior. Let's look at the next defense mechanism, displacement. So key emphasis on place. Why? Because this is where somebody is going to place their emotions onto something less threatening, not to mistake it for projection or reaction formation, because reaction formation is where you react or act out the opposite emotion than you're actually experiencing. And projection is where you have that projector on your chest and you're putting your own feelings and thoughts onto somebody else. Displacement is where you are placing your frustrations, feelings, impulses onto somebody less threatening. So it's different from reaction formation, because reaction formation, you may be putting forth an action, but it's the opposite emotion. Displacement is where you're expressing the emotion that you actually are experiencing onto something less threatening. And that's the key thing there, is onto something less threatening, because it is oftentimes too distressful for them to express it onto something that could have some consequences in some way, shape, or form. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. Someone is mad at their girlfriend, so they yell at their young child. They're not willing to yell at the girlfriend because the girlfriend could potentially defend itself. So, they still express their frustration by yelling. It's just at somebody less threatening, such as a young child. Another example, someone did not pass their ASWB exam. So when they get home, they punch a pillow 100 times. I don't know about you, but if you punch a pillow, it's likely not going to hurt you unless you're putting it up to a wall or cement block. So again, you're still expressing your anger by punching something. You're just punching something that is having a lower likelihood of actually hurting you, such as punching a pillow 100 times. Another example, someone is frustrated with their boss. So instead of yelling at their boss, because that could have some consequences, they punch their computer screen. Again, they still may get in trouble for punching the computer screen, but they will get in less trouble by damaging the computer than they would if they yelled at their boss or punched their boss directly across their face. So displacement is where you are placing your frustrations and emotions onto something less threatening. Because again, reaction formation is where you are acting out the opposite emotional formation than you're actually feeling. Displacement, you're acting out the emotional formation that you directly are experiencing at that given moment, with the key component on to something less threatening. The next defense mechanism up to bat, intellectualization, key emphasis on intellect. Think of intellect meaning you are going to be an intellectual, or you're thinking about as much knowledge as you could possibly muster. So intellectualization is where you think intellectually in order to process experiences rather than emotionally processing them in some way, shape, or form. So stated in a different way, it's the overemphasis on thinking when confronted with an unacceptable impulse, situation, or behavior without employing any emotion in any way, shape, or form. So you are going to get as much knowledge or think so rationally that you are never going to have to acknowledge your emotions in any way, shape, or form. So rather than dealing with the pain associated with the emotion, a person will follow up or focus on a content area in particular. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. A person was recently diagnosed with anxiety and will attempt to learn about all the symptoms of having anxiety rather than expressing their feelings about their diagnosis of anxiety. Intellectualization, they try to become an intellectual or get as much information as they can about a topic versus actually emotionally processing it in some way, shape, or form. Another example, a person copes with the recent death of a parent by researching the grief process versus acknowledging the pain they are feeling related to losing their parent. So again, they're getting as much information as they possibly can. They're going DABDA, they're doing Keebler-Ross, trying to get the stages of grief, and I saying this is what I'm going to be experiencing versus actually experiencing it naturally in some way, shape, or form. Another example, someone failed the ASWB exam and put focus on learning the different content areas that they missed rather than reflecting on how failing feels. So somebody is reading that sheet and so focused on the content areas that they missed that they're not reflecting on how it felt to actually fail. So they're harboring the resentment and emotions that they have related to failing the exam versus unpacking those, allowing for this to be a fresh attempt, and then starting to get back into studying. because a lot of times people are going to be emotionally harboring things, which could cause them to be less likely to pass than if they were to actually express their emotions in a healthy manner rather than trying to intellectualize things, which could lead to less favorable results. The next defense mechanism up to bat is going to be rationalization. So, key emphasis on rational, because this is where somebody is going to come up with rational thoughts to defend the behaviors that they are doing. So, this is where they are going to identify rationales or identify excuses for their behavior. And a lot of times people will get denial and rationalization mixed up. Denial, they're not willing to acknowledge the negative impacts of anything in any way, shape, or form, while rationalization, they're going to kind of identify that it's a negative behavior, yet that it's not a problem for them based on all of these excuses that they can come up with because it's too emotionally painful to acknowledge the pain that they're experiencing. So, stated in a different way, it's explaining or trying to come up with an excuse for an unacceptable behavior or feeling in a rational or logical manner, which is avoiding the true reason and or multiple reasons for the behavior or thoughts that they're experiencing. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. Someone loses a job and says, I didn't even like the job anyway. I was going to quit anyhow. They're doing me a favor, versus being like, man, it really sucks that I lost this job and I would rather have quit on my own time, but they're doing me a favor now. Another example, someone gets turned down for a date and says, I had a lot of things going on anyway. Even though they wanted to go on the date with the person, they may come up with an excuse of like, man, I was busy. I was doing them a favor by going on a date. Do you know how many dates they've been on in the last year? Psh, that's their loss, not mine. Another example, someone fails their ASWB exam and says, I'm content with my current job. I don't even need to pass this exam anyway. It didn't mean nothing to me. I didn't even care if I failed. But again, they wanted to pass. It's just painful to acknowledge the fact that they failed. Even though they may be comfortable in their job, they still have dreams and aspirations outside of that job. And it's too painful to say this exam is potentially a step that I haven't been able to get over in order to get to those dreams and goals. Rationalization, you come up with a rationale or an excuse for why something is the way that it actually is without actually acknowledging how you feel emotionally. The last defense mechanism is going to be undoing. So the last one, and less primitive, is going to be undoing. So key emphasis on do, because this is where somebody tries to do something just like Nike, just do it in order to make up for a bad behavior or thought. And this is going to be different from acting out, because acting out is where somebody is going to engage in actions in order to express how they feel, while undoing is trying to do a behavior in order to make up for something that has been done, whether the individual views it as a problem or not. So let's look at this a little bit closer. So undoing is where somebody tries to do something to make up for an inappropriate or undesirable thought or multiple thoughts, as well as multiple behaviors that can cause isolation from the overall society. So a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. After cheating on your boyfriend or girlfriend, you buy them a video game to make up for it. The partner may not know that you cheated, but you're buying them a gift that they may just be like, man, they're so nice. I'm so glad that they did it. But it's a way for you to clear your conscience of being a bad individual for cheating on that person in some way, shape, or form. Another example, a husband may do the dishes after insulting his wife to make up for the behavior. Again, man, I made that insult rather than apologizing and acknowledging what I've done. I'm just going to do the dishes because I know that could be a way that could help pave all of these things over. Another example, someone missed a date with their significant other, so they buy them flowers and surprise them with it. And again, this one, they the individual knows that the person missed the date, but they buy them flowers in order to try and make up for missing the date in some way, shape, or form. So undoing is where somebody actively tries to do, they try to do, they try to do something in order to make up for something that they've done. So they acknowledge that they've done something bad or inappropriate, but they're doing actions rather than expressing it out loud. So the mature defense mechanisms is where it gets a little trickier based on the fact that as we go down the rungs of primitive being entirely unconscious, less primitive becoming more conscious, but still trying to deny reality, the mature defense mechanisms is where somebody has a healthy and conscious relationship with reality. So reality is accepted even if it's not appreciated. So this is where somebody may actively become aware of what they're doing and put forth action in order to improve it. So uncomfortable feelings are deliberately transformed into something less threatening than just setting it aside. So that's going to be the important part, is this is going to be somebody actively doing something versus just setting it aside and not acknowledging it in some way, shape, or form. So a couple of easy defense mechanisms are going to be similar to the ones that we've reviewed prior. And as we go over those, I'm going to be tying them back to the ones that we have already reviewed. So the first one up to bat is going to be sublimation. So key emphasis on sub, because when you think of sub, think of substitute, because sublimation is substituting a negative behavior for a more positive behavior. So if somebody's doing a negative behavior, sublimation is where they put a positive behavior in place of that negative behavior that they were doing. And a lot of times people will get reaction formation, displacement, or projection mixed up with sublimation. But remember, reaction formation is where somebody is going to react in the opposite emotional formation than they're actually feeling. Projection, think of them having a projector on their chest. They're putting their feelings, experiences, and stories onto somebody else. While displacement is where somebody is going to be placing their emotions and frustrations onto something less threatening, while sublimation is where somebody is focusing on themselves and they're putting a positive behavior in place of a negative one in order to improve their life. So this is where they act out unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or impulses in a more constructive or positive manner. So a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. A man with a lot of anger may start working out. Another example, someone who has a lot of frustration towards a parent may play violent video games to express their anger. Someone may draw on themselves to avoid self-harming themselves. So if somebody was previously self-harming, they may draw on themselves in place of self-harming in order to still express the urge that they were experiencing, but it's in a more positive manner. The next defense mechanism up to bat is going to be suppression. So key emphasis on suppress. And when you think of suppress, think of silence, because if you're suppressing something, you are reducing the volume that it has. And not to get this mistaken for repression or regression based on the fact that repression is where somebody's mind is going to press out traumatic and distressing memories outside of what they are conscious of. Regression, key emphasis on regress, because they are going to regress or go back to previously appropriately developmental behaviors, while suppression is where somebody is going to silence something voluntarily, or consciously, avoiding thinking about disturbing thoughts, wishes, and feelings, problems, or experiences temporarily. That is going to be the key difference here, is that it's voluntarily or consciously, as well as for a temporary segment of time. Because repression is where somebody's mind will unconsciously press the memory outside of somebody's recollection because it's too painful for them. Suppression is where somebody will actively silence something for a moment in time and then revisit it at a later date. So it's like putting a book on the shelf that you want to read, but then coming back and reading it when you have the time to do so. A couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. While taking the ASWB exam, the person isn't thinking about the potential loss of money if they fail. They are locked and loaded, breaking down every question systematically to go into the exam to kick it directly in the chest to get the job done. However, after the exam, they may think about all of the factors that led up to them going inside of the exam. Another example, a woman starts at work late to avoid fighting with her husband. So she stays at work late to avoid fighting with her husband, based on the fact that she consciously knows that if I stay at work late, I will have a lower likelihood of fighting with my husband. However, you can only temporarily stay at work, and therefore, you're not going to stay there 100% of your days because it's a temporary fix, but you still have to address and assess the situation at some capacity. Another example, someone knows that they are behind on their mortgage, but go to Disneyland anyway. So they voluntarily and consciously pause the stress related to their mortgage to go to Disneyland, live their best life, but that mortgage and then being not behind on the mortgage is going to be there when they come back. So that's the difference between suppression and the other defense mechanisms, is that this person is making an active choice to not acknowledge something temporarily in order to have a more satisfying reality for the moment. The next defense mechanism up to bat is going to be compensation. So key emphasis on compensate, because this is where somebody is going to compensate themselves or somebody else in order to make themselves look more favorable while lacking in another area of their life. So, stated a different way, it's making yourself more appealing or compensated in one area in order to avoid exploiting the failures that you are experiencing. So, it's overachieving in one area to compensate for failures in other areas. And that's going to be different from undoing, because undoing is doing something to make up for a particular thought as well as a behavior, while compensation is where somebody is going to overcompensate in one area to avoid acknowledging drawbacks or holes within their life. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. Someone is not good at schoolwork, so they put all of their energy into sports to excel in the best way that they can. Another example, a husband works a lot, so he can buy his wife whatever she wants to make up for the absence of time. So they know that the career-wise that they are doing rather well, while in the relationship field, they're not doing so great. Another example, Phil is not good with time management, so he puts his focus in engaging and performing when he completes tasks because he's not good at completing them in a timely manner or having a concept of time. Again, lacking in one area of life, but making up for it in another area of life. The next defense mechanism is altruism. So, key emphasis on all, because altruism is focused on benefiting every single individual in order to make up for things that you have experienced in some way, shape, or form. So, altruism is looking to benefit all of the individuals that are experiencing something that you have experienced in some way, shape, or form. So, stated in a different way, it's satisfying internal needs through helping other individuals. So it's helping others suffering from similar feelings or experience, or who are far less along in dealing with similar issues that you have experienced in some way. So it's you passing your wisdom or strategies and techniques to somebody that is not as far along in a process than you are. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. Someone who was bullied as a child will start an anti-bullying campaign to prevent others from experiencing it as well. So they have a lived experience of being bullied. They know what it feels like to be bullied. So they no longer want anyone to feel what it feels like to be bullied. Another example, someone who lost a friend to cancer will start an organization to spread information on how to lower the risk of cancer. So, therefore, somebody has a lived experience of losing somebody to cancer. So, they're doing a lot of research and a lot of advocating to reduce the likelihood that somebody has to experience what they did in the past. Another example, someone struggled with learning on how to take exams. So they start making YouTube videos to help people succeed who have failed, to build themselves up to become the best possible version of themselves, to go into the exam to kick it directly in the chest to get the job done. So somebody has a lived experience of knowing that studying can be difficult and not every study material is built for everybody, or that if you don't believe that you can do something, that you won't achieve it. So they start helping other people believe that they can accomplish things that they may not even know that they are aware of, as well as giving strategies and techniques to navigate a stressful process, to go into the exam, to kick it directly in the chest, to get the job done. So internalization is the next defense mechanism that we'll go over, and key emphasis on internal, because this is when somebody's internal processing is going to be forever changed based on something that they were taught when they were younger. So internalization is often going to be mixed up with identification and introjection. So let's follow this a little bit closer. So internalization is when somebody's internal processing is going to change. Stated in a different way, it's when somebody will take the opinions, values, and feedback from others and change their identity or themselves based on that feedback. Whether it be a positive example or a negative example is going to be up to the individual and what they've experienced. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. Someone tells a person that they are dumb and that they will never succeed in life. So, regardless of what the person hears from others, they will feel like they are never enough, regardless of what they accomplish, based on the fact that internalization is where somebody is going to internalize the words of what other people have told them and view themselves of the perception of the people that have demeaned them in the past. Another example, someone tells a child that they will either end up locked up or dead. That child will remember that message and feel like they cannot do anything but get locked up or die, so they do not try to strive to become the best possible version of themselves. Another example, someone hears from their ex-girlfriend that they are unlovable and continue to believe it and play it out in future relationships. So that person received negative feedback from somebody, and their internal processing or their internal view of themselves is forever changed. A positive one would be if somebody told you that you are going to be great, and as long as you believe in something, that you are going to achieve it, and to not let one thought, one situation, or one person decide what you need to be doing. It could forever change your internal process, that regardless of what people tell you, you can get the job done. Internalization is when your internal processing forever change and can influence future situations. The next defense mechanism that we'll go over is going to be identification. And identification and introjection are oftentimes going to get mixed up. However, one of them can lead into the other. So introjection is the one that often can lead into identification. Let's go over identification first, and then we'll see how introjection is different and can lead into identification. So, identification, key emphasis on identify, because this is where it's going to change how somebody identifies in order to fit an ideal role that they deem desirable. So, identification is where somebody is going to identify to fit an ideal role. Stated in a different way, their identity changes to fit this ideal role. So you see yourself like something that you want, and you firmly believe that you can become that role. So you see something you like and you want to become it in some way, shape, or form. So this is where you start to display a trait or value that you find desirable. It's just not an activity that you do, but you try to do everything that this other individual does. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. Someone who likes Beyonce may start to dance and act just like her. Again, they start to identify as Beyonce. Another example, someone who has a close relative that is a social worker may become one just to be like them. They're like, man, my aunt or my uncle is a social worker. I really want to be like my aunt and uncle because they're really awesome. So then you become a social worker to become your aunt or uncle. Another example, someone hears that Michael Jordan likes to gamble. So they start to gamble to act just like he does in order to become Michael Jordan. So identification is where you start to identify as an individual that you deem desirable. The next defense mechanism that we'll go over is introjection. So there are two ways that I often tell people to recognize and apply it. And the first one is intro, because this is where you start to introduce yourself to a particular behavior or person, but are not trying to identify as that individual. Another thing that you can utilize is jection, because if you view it as an injection, if you inject something inside of yourself, you have to keep re-administering that particular thing in order to make it effective. So this is where you can inject something in your life, but it could fade away over time. Stated in a different way, it's when somebody will hear an idea and play it out in their life as if it is real. It's when somebody hears an ideology or idea and they act like it is what their future will look like. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. Someone hears that they should not get into a pool until 30 minutes after they eat something. But again, introjection or injection can fade away, because when I was a child, I heard this 100% of my days. Phil, do not get in the pool. You just ate. You have to wait 30 minutes. Now, as an adult, I'll eat something and I'm elbow dropping right into the pool based on the fact that it was introduced to me, but now I've identified what is best with them for my situation. Another example, the child hears that boys do not cry and they start to play it out in their life as if it is true. However, over time, they're given new pieces of information. They can make adaptations for what they want their life to look like. However, if they don't, and they're continuously introduced or injected with all these different things, it could solidify and influence their identity. Another example, someone sees a celebrity that they like, use a particular makeup, and they begin utilizing the makeup to be just like them. So they're just utilizing the makeup, not trying to identify, not doing everything that person's doing. They're simply doing one thing that the other individual is doing. So identification is where somebody will identify as that particular individual, while introjection is where something is introduced to the individual. However, it is not making up their identity, as well as it's something that could be injected in your life, but could fade away over time. And the last defense mechanism that we'll look at is going to be asceticism. So key emphasis on set, because this is where somebody is going to have a set way of doing things, and they are going to delay pleasure in order to accomplish a particular goal. A lot of social workers experience asceticism based on the fact that we will delay pleasure in order to accomplish a particular goal or to satisfy the needs of another individual. So let's look at this a little bit closer. It's when somebody displays rigid behaviors based on an ideology that they deem important. It's when somebody will be stuck in their ways, regardless of contradictory information. So it's severe discipline that is shown in avoidance of all forms of self indulgence until the person accomplishes a particular goal. So, a couple of examples to articulate this a little bit further. A person refuses to eat or sleep until a project is done. Stated in a different way, a social worker will refuse to eat until they complete their progress notes. Another example, not watching your favorite TV show to have more focus on passing your SWB exam. You may love that TV show, but if you're practicing asceticism, you may stop watching the TV show, utilize that time to study for the exam to increase or empower yourself to kick the exam directly in the chest to get the job done. Another example, avoiding sweets on Thanksgiving because you want to lose weight. You're avoiding a pleasure, such as eating sweets, in order to accomplish a particular goal, which in this situation is going to be to lose weight in some way, shape, or form. So, those are easy ways to be able to recognize and apply the defense mechanisms from one another. So, this session went over the psychosexual theory of development, the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latent stage, the genital stage, as well as the three levels of the mind: conscious, preconscious, and unconscious levels of the mind, the three components of personality: id, ego, as well as super ego, and concepts related to those, as well as the defense mechanisms, the primitive defense mechanisms, the less primitive defense mechanisms, as well as the mature defense mechanisms. And as I stated at the beginning, do not try to memorize all of this, but identifies ways in order to recognize and apply it to practice questions, because a lot of times people will beat themselves up and be hard on themselves for not being able to understand all of this, or be like, man, I'm not really sure what all of this means. But being able to recognize and apply it, or even discern it from other concepts related to the same thing, are going to allow for you to go into the exam to be more confident and comfortable in order to be more competent to kick the exam directly in the chest. So as you're going through the session, do not try to memorize, do not try to beat yourself up, but give yourself credit in order to show up, to get into the exam, kick it directly in the chest to get the job done. Question 1. A 45-year-old male is attending an intake assessment with a social worker at a community mental health clinic. The man reports that he finds it difficult to control his impulses, which has resulted in him stealing and getting into frequent fights with friends. Which personality style is the client most likely aligned with? A, id, B, ego, C, superego, D, ego, ideal. And when you have your answer, type the word joy in the chat. Opening the polls. 20 more seconds. Shutting down the polls. The majority think it is A. Second place is B. Third place is C. Fourth place is D. Let's look at it. So we're meeting with a 45-year-old male. They're attending an intake assessment. Any length of time, hop on top of it because it always paints the picture of what we're looking at with a social worker at a community mental health clinic. So that's who we are and where we are at. The man reports that he finds it difficult to control his impulses, which has resulted in him stealing and getting into frequent fights with friends. Which personality style is the client most likely aligned with? Let's break down each personality style, compare back to the question to see what we're looking at in particular. A, id is going to be ID, impulsive decision making. B, ego is going to be the evaluate and then go or let it go. And then super ego is going to be that superhero. And then ego ideal is a part of the superego. And when we are doing what people around us want us to do, so we are aware of the expectations of others. So let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So, quick review: 45-year-old male. That's our client. Tenant intake assessment. Any length of time, hop on top of it because it helps paint the picture of what we're looking at with the social record of community mental health clinic. So that is who we are and where we are at. In the man reports, he finds it difficult to control his impulses, which has resulted in him stealing and getting into frequent fights. So keep all that in mind as we go through each answer choice. So right off the bat, we're going to rule out D. Why? Because that's not based on any of the personality styles. It's just a component of one of the personality styles, which is the super ego. So now if we have to think about it, the id is going to be the devil on the shoulder. That's like, come on, man, it's not that big of a deal. The ego is the character or person in the middle that's trying to identify what they should do in between the id, impulsive decision making, or the angel, the superego, in deciding where to go. So for that reason, we have a client that finds it difficult to control his impulses and he's stealing and getting into fights with friends. So therefore, we're going to rule out C because a superhero is not going to be beating up innocent individuals as well as stealing from other individuals. We're also going to rule out B based on the fact that this person is doing impulsive decisions as well as operating out of that pleasure principle of staying within what is pleasurable versus what society is actually demanding of them. So the correct answer here is A, id, based on the fact they find it difficult to control their impulses and they're stealing and fighting other individuals. B is incorrect because the ego would be somebody that's trying to balance the impulsive decision making and the demands of society, while C, superego, would be thinking about how to be a superhero and continue to have morals within the situation. So the correct answer here is A, id, impulsive decision making, based on the fact they're finding it difficult to control their impulses, as well as stealing and getting into frequent fights. The correct answer here is A, id. So that's how we look at that question in particular. Question 2. A social worker is meeting with a 10-year-old boy that was referred by his teacher for complaints of throwing objects across the room at other students. The boy reports that he finds his schoolwork simple and that he just wants to talk with other students. And when the teacher tells him no, that he gets angry. What psychosexual stage of development best explains the boy's behavior? A, phallic, B, latent, C, genital, or D, anal. And when you have your answer, type the word Michigan in the chat. Opening the polls. Twenty more seconds. Shutting down the polls. The majority think it is B. Second place is D. Third place is A and C. Let's look at it. We're a social worker who's meeting with a 10-year-old boy. So that's who we are and who our client is. That was referred by the teacher for complaints of throwing objects across the room at other students. The boy reports to our direct client that he finds his schoolwork simple and that he just wants to talk with other students. And when the teacher tells him no, he's getting angry. So that's what he's presenting with. So, what psychosexual stage of development best explains the boy's behavior? So, let's break down each stage by the age and then compare it back to the question and utilize the specifics of this stage to identify our answer. So, A, the phallic stage is going to be from 3 to 6 years old. B, the latent stage is going to be 6 years old until puberty. And then the genital stage is going to be puberty until death. And then the anal stage is going to be 1 to 3 years old. So let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So, quick review: social worker, 10-year-old boy. So that's who we are, where our client is at, referred by his teacher for complaints of throwing objects across the room at other students. So we're at a school. The boy reports to our direct client that he finds his schoolwork simple and that he just wants to talk with other students. And when the teacher tells him no, he's getting angry. So keep all that in mind as we go through each answer choice. And so right off the bat, We're going to rule out D. Why? Because it's not really talking about toilet training. And this could be similar to anal expulsive. However, the primary focus is based on wanting to socialize with other individuals, and being restricted is causing a problem within the situation. So D is going to be incorrect because there is another term that could better align with what he is experiencing. We're also going to rule out A, the phallic stage, because it's not talking about feeling themselves or identifying their genitalia in any way, shape, or form, or relationships with parents in any way, shape, or form. So now we're in between B, latent. Again, key emphasis on late. So you visualize somebody being late and they want to socialize with every single person to start developing peer relationships. And C, genital stage, is where they are going to utilize their genitals and get into sexual relationships while also identifying how to balance life in the best way that they can. So if we look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular, referred by the teacher for complaints of throwing objects across the room at other students. Then the boy reports he finds his schoolwork simple and that he wants to talk with other students. He wants to talk with other students. And when the teacher tells him no, he's getting angry. So for that reason, we're going to rule out C, because nowhere is it talking about a sexual relationship. And it's more talking about the latent stage of where he feels like he is late. So he's trying to communicate with every single person that he can in order to develop peer relationships. So A is going to be incorrect because he's not feeling himself and identifying his genitalia or having some type of feelings towards his parents. C is going to be incorrect because he's not trying to establish any sexual relationships that we know of. And D is incorrect because you could associate the way that he is reacting to anal explosive like an explosive. However, it's not related to being restricted. It's about wanting to develop social relationships. And it feels like the teachers get in the way with that. So that is why it's causing him anger. So the correct answer here is going to be B, the latent stage, because he wants to socialize and all of his energy is put forth towards developing social relationships. So the correct answer here is B, the latent stage. So that's how we look at that question in particular. Question 3. A social worker in an outpatient clinic is working with a family and their 6-year-old son who has been waking up in the middle of the night to sleep with them. The mother reports that her son will not let her out of his sight, and when he cannot see her, he will scream at the top of his lungs. The boy reports that he does not understand why he becomes so frustrated, but he feels like someone is going to take his mother away from him. What psychosexual stage of development best describes the boy's behavior? A, anal, B, phallic, C, oral, or D, latent. And when you have your answer, type the word motivation in the chat. Opening the polls. 20 more seconds. Shutting down the polls. The majority think it is B. Second place is C. Third place is A and D. Let's look at it. We're a social worker in an outpatient clinic, so that's who we are and where we are at, working with a family and their 6-year-old son. So that is our client system, and the son who has been waking up in the middle of the night to sleep with them. So the son is going to be more of the focus of our clientele. So the mother reports, so not our direct client, but part of the client system, that her son will not let her out of his sight. And when he cannot see her, he will scream at the top of his lungs. So our direct client, another person in the client system, that does not understand why he becomes so frustrated, but he feels like someone is going to take his mother away from him. So that is how he is experiencing the situation. Which psychosexual stage of development best describes the boy's behavior? So let's identify each stage with the age, compare the stage back to the question, and utilize the specifics of that stage to identify what the correct answer is. A, the anal stage is from 1 to 3 years old. B, the phallic stage of where they are feeling themselves is from 3 to 6 years old. C, the oral stage is from 0 to 1 years old. And then the latent stage, key emphasis on late, they feel like they're late. This is going to be 6 years old to puberty. Let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So, quick review. We're a social worker at an outpatient clinic. That's who we are, where we're at, working with a family and 6-year-old son. The 6-year-old son has been waking up in the middle of the night to sleep with his parents. The mother reports that her son will not let her out of his sight. And when he cannot see her, he will scream at the top of his lungs, "There's a problem." The boy reports that he does not understand why he becomes so frustrated, but he feels like someone's going to take his mother away from him. So keep all that in mind as we go through each answer choice. So right off the bat, we're going to rule out C. Why? Because nowhere in the question does it state that this individual is deriving pleasure from their mouth in order to survive and strive in some way, shape, or form, or that they had a maladaptive relationship with their parent and or caregiver and are now kind of avoidant of that parent and or caregiver. If anything, they want that parent or caregiver's attention more so than they did in the past. We're also going to rule out A. Why? Because it's not talking about toilet training or that the parents were overly anxious on them or too lenient and let the child do whatever the heck they wanted to do. So now we're in between B and D. B, the phallic stage, is where the child is starting to feel themselves to discover their genitalia, and they can either have the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex. But in this situation, since it is a 6-year-old boy, it would be the Oedipus complex, where they have a strong sexual attraction to their mother. Or D, latent, key emphasis on late, where he feels late and he wants to socialize with a lot of people. But let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at to make sure we're not making a mistake. So we have a 6-year-old son waking up in the middle of the night. Mother reports son will not let her out of his sight. And when he cannot see her, he is screaming at the top of his lungs. And he does not understand why he becomes so frustrated, but he feels like someone is going to take his mother away from him. So for that reason, we're going to rule out D, because he's not trying to socialize. He's more in the phallic stage of experiencing the Oedipus complex of wanting to have a relationship with the mother and fearing that someone is going to take her from him. So A is going to be incorrect because it's not talking about toilet training or that there's anal retentive or anal explosive type tendencies. C is incorrect because we're not talking about attachment or deriving pleasure from the mouth and trying to survive in some way, shape, or form. And D is incorrect because we're not talking about developing a social network and trying to communicate with other individuals. It's talking about a 6-year-old boy experiencing the Oedipus complex towards his mother and fearing that something bad could happen to her. So the correct answer here is B, the phallic stage. So that's how we look at that question in particular. Question 4. A social worker in an outpatient clinic is working with a family and their 15-year-old son who has been skipping school and that they recently caught having sex with one of his peers in their home. The 15-year-old son does not see any issues with this behavior and believes his parents are overreacting and need to loosen up. What psychosexual stage of development best describes the boy's behavior? A, oral, B, latent, C, phallic, or D, genital. And when you have your answer, type the word lions in the chat. Opening the poll. Twenty more seconds. Shutting down the polls. The majority think it is D. Second place is B. Third place is A and C. Let's look at it. We're a social worker in an outpatient clinic. So that's who we are and where we're at. Working with a 15-year-old son and his family. So that is going to be our client system. In the 15-year-old son, so that is going to be our client who has been skipping school and he's recently caught having sex with one of his peers in the family home. The 15-year-old son, who is our direct client, does not see any issues with this behavior and believes his parents are overreacting and they just need to loosen up. What psychosexual stage of development best describes the boy's behavior? So let's break down each stage based on the age and then compare the specifics of the stage back to the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So A, the oral stage is going to be from 0 to 1 years old. B, the latent stage is going to be 6 years old to puberty. The phallic stage is going to be 3 to 6 years old. And then D, genital, is going to be puberty to death. Let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So, quick review. Social worker, outpatient clinic. That's who we are, where we're at, working with the family and the 15-year-old son. 15-year-old son is the primary focus because he's been skipping school and recently was caught having sex with one of his peers in the family home. 15-year-old son does not see any issues with his behavior and believes his parents are overreacting and they just need to loosen up. So keep all their mind as we go through each answer choice. So right off the bat, we are going to rule out A. Why? Because we're not talking about pleasure derived from the mouth or survival in any way, shape, or form, or that he has a maladaptive attachment to his parents in any way, shape, or form. We're also going to rule out C because we're not talking about him feeling himself or discovering his genitalia or that he's experiencing the Oedipus complex within this situation of the attraction to his mother. And now we're in between B, latent, key emphasis on late, where all of the sexual libido or libido energy is suppressed and is more focused on socializing with other individuals, or D, genital, where the libido energy or sexual energy is revved like a small engine and they're trying to have sexual relationships with other individuals. Let's look back at the question to make sure we're not making a mistake. 15-year-old son skipping school and recently caught having sex with one of his peers in the family home. So that is a key component. Does not see any issues with this behavior and believes his parents are overreacting. So for that reason, we're going to rule out B. Why? Because the sexual energy is not suppressed. It's revved up like a small engine because what has been suppressed must be heard at some capacity. So the correct answer here is D, genital stage, because A, again, the oral stage is based on oral stimulation of pleasure derived from survival. B is incorrect because during the latent stage, all of the libido is suppressed in order to focus on socializing. In this situation, it's not suppressed based on the fact that he was caught having sex with one of his peers. C is incorrect because it does involve genital, but it doesn't involve him identifying it for the very first time. And he's not having the Oedipus complex where he is having a sexual attraction to his mom. So the correct answer here is D, the genital stage, because he utilizes genital in a sexual manner in order to have a sexual relationship with another individual. So the correct answer here is D, genital stage. So that's how we'd look at that question in particular. Question 5. A social worker is meeting with a 35-year-old who is scheduled to be released from jail within the next week. The man was charged with an assault and spent the last year in the county jail. The man reports that he finds it difficult to control his anger and does not like when people challenge him. The social worker reviews a list of anger management techniques with the man that he can utilize upon his release. The man reports that he has always wanted to learn how to draw and will attempt to do that to express his anger. What defense mechanism is the man most likely utilizing? A, reaction formation, B, displacement, C, sublimation, D, identification. And when you have your answer, type the word faith in the chat. Opening the poll. $20 more seconds. Shutting down the polls. The majority think it is C. Second place is A. Third place is B. Fourth place is D. Let's look at it. We're a social worker who's meeting with a 35-year-old. So that is who we are and who our client is, who is scheduled to be released from jail within the next week, any length of time. Hop on top of it because it also paints the picture of what we're looking at this given moment. So our client is going to be released from jail within the next week. The man was charged with an assault and spent the last year in the county jail. Any length of time, hop on top of it because it also paints the picture of what we're looking at this given moment. Man reports that he finds it difficult to control his anger and does not like when people challenge him. Social worker reviews a list of anger management techniques with the man that he can utilize upon his release. The man reports that he has always wanted to learn how to draw and will attempt to do that to express his anger. What defense mechanism is the man most likely utilizing? Let's break down each defense mechanism, compare back to the question to see what we're looking at in particular. A, reaction formation is when someone will react in the opposite emotional formation than they actually feel. B, displacement is when someone expresses or places their emotions onto something or someone less threatening. C, sublimation is when someone will substitute a positive behavior in place of a negative one. D, identification is when someone changes their identity based on an ideal role that they have in mind. So let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So quick review, social worker, 35-year-old. So that's who we are, where we're at. The 35-year-old is scheduled to be released from jail within the next week. Any length of time, hop on top of it because it always paints the picture of what we're looking at. The man was charged with an assault and spent the last year in the county jail. Any length of time, hop on top of it because it always paints the picture of what we're looking at. The man reports that he finds it difficult to control his anger and does not like when people challenge him. Social worker reviews a list of anger management techniques with a man that he can utilize upon release, which would be within the next week. And the man reports he has always wanted to learn how to draw and will attempt to do that to express his anger. So keep all that in mind as we go through each answer choice. So right off the bat, we're going to rule out A. Why? Because he states that he is going to express his anger by drawing. He's not saying, hey, I'm going to be happy rather than angry because I'm internally angry, but I'm just going to outwardly express that I am happy. So he's not reacting in the opposite emotional formation. We're also going to rule out D, identification, because unless he was like, you know what? I heard of this famous drawing individual. So I'm going to start drawing based on the fact that I want to be them. I want to become Picasso, or I want to become Michelangelo. I want to be all these artist type figures based on the fact that that's what I deem important. Nowhere in the question does he state that he wants to draw based on the fact that he wants to be those individuals, based on the fact that he happened to see it from a list of anger management techniques that we showed him. So now we're between B, displacement, where he expresses or places his emotions onto something less threatening, where C, sublimation, he's substituting a behavior in place of an old behavior. So if we look back at the question to make sure we're not making a mistake, he's going to be released from the county jail within the next week. He finds it difficult to control his anger, views a list of anger management techniques, and he states that he's always wanted to draw. So he may attempt to draw in order to express his anger. So if we think about it, unless he's putting his anger onto the pencil and snapping them in half while drawing, which is likely not going to be helpful if you're trying to complete a drawing, B is going to be ruled out. So for that reason, B, displacement, is ruled out because it's not placing the anger onto the pencil or pen and destroying that based on the fact that he is expressing what he's feeling in a different manner. Why? Because if we look at it, he finds it difficult to control his anger and he wants to draw in order to express his anger. So A is going to be ruled out because he's not expressing the opposite emotional formation. B is incorrect because he's not placing his anger onto someone or something less threatening. And D is incorrect because he's not trying to identify with the famous artist. So the correct answer here is C. Why? Because he is substituting the drawing in place of his old anger expression, such as assault, in some way, shape, or form. So the correct answer here is sublimation, based on the fact that he substituted in drawing to express his anger. So that's how we look at that question in particular. Question 6. A social worker in an outpatient clinic is meeting with a 30-year-old female who has recently fired from her job. The woman reports that she feels like her boss never liked her and that her boss is just jealous of her. The woman reports that she expressed her frustration of being fired by throwing a chair through her office window to avoid physically harming her boss. What defense mechanism best explains the woman's behavior? A, denial, B, projection, C, reaction formation, D, displacement. And when you have your answer, type the word growth in the chat. Opening the polls. 20 more seconds. Shutting down the polls. The majority think it is D. Second place is B and C. Third place is A. Let's look at it. We're a social worker in an outpatient clinic, so that's who we are and where we are at, meeting with a 30-year-old female. So that's our client who was recently fired from her job. So that's what brought her in to services. The woman reports that she feels like her boss never liked her and that her boss is just jealous of her. So that is her perception of the situation. The woman reports that she expressed her frustration of being fired by throwing a chair through her office window to avoid physically harming her boss. What defense mechanism best explains the woman's behavior? So let's break down each defense mechanism, compare back to the question to see what we're looking at in particular. A, denial is when someone does not acknowledge an action or behavior by not taking negative criticism or critique. B, projection is when someone will put their feelings, thoughts, and or behaviors onto someone else. C, reaction formation is when someone will react in the opposite emotional formation than they actually feel. In displacement, D is when someone expresses or places their emotions onto someone or something less threatening. So let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So quick review. Social worker outpatient clinic. So that's who we are, where we're at, meeting with a 30-year-old female. That's our client who's recently fired from her job. One reports that she feels like her boss never liked her and that the boss is just jealous of her. The woman reports she expressed her frustration of being fired by throwing a chair through her office window to avoid physically harming her boss. So keep all that in mind as we go through each answer choice. So right off the bat, we're going to rule out A. Why? Because denial, this 30-year-old female would have not even have stated that they threw the chair through the window. They wouldn't even acknowledge the fact that they got fired from the job. They'd have been like, wasn't me. I didn't really do it. I don't know where you got your information from, but wasn't me. I'm not even sure. I'm not that type of person. How could you even think that I would throw a chair through a window just like a frisbee and even get fired from a job? It wasn't me. We're also going to rule out B, projection. Why? Because projection would be where this 30-year-old female put their experience onto somebody else. So if we look back at the question, she says she feels like her boss never liked her and that her boss is just jealous of her. If she came out and said, hey, you know what? I'm actually jealous of my boss, and this is why I reacted in the way that I did, we're looking at more along the lines of projection. But the question continues going on and saying that she expressed her frustration of being fired by throwing a chair through the office window, just like a frisbee, to avoid physically harming her boss and breaking her jaw. So now is this reaction formation where she's reacting in the opposite emotional formation than she actually feels, or D, displacement, placing the emotions that she's actually experiencing onto someone or something else less threatening. So if we think about it, she said she expressed her frustration of being fired by throwing the office chair. So if you think about that, she was frustrated and threw the chair. And the purpose was to avoid physically harming the boss. Therefore, she said, I was very ticked off that I was fired. And I expressed that being ticked off or frustration by doing something directly, not to my boss, but something else that is actually still detrimental, but not as detrimental as physically harming the boss. So for that reason, we're going to rule out C because reaction formation would be where she was frustrated, but then walked him and was like, man, you're the best boss I've ever met. I'm going to miss working here. This is the greatest place ever. How could you ever, ever carry on without me here? I don't even know. My life is now over. Would be reaction formation. D, displacement is where she was frustrated and she placed the frustration not on her boss, but by throwing the office chair through the window like a frisbee, even though it still was violence, it was not violence towards somebody else. So it was considered something less threatening. A, denial is incorrect because she's not outright denying that something exists. B is incorrect because she's not putting her experience onto somebody else. And C is incorrect because she is frustrated and expressed frustration or anger by throwing the office chair. So the correct answer here is D, displacement, because she placed her frustration or anger onto something or someone less threatening, aka by not harming her boss. So the correct answer here is D, displacement. So that's how we look at that question in particular. Question 7. A social worker in a community mental health clinic has been working with a 29-year-old male for 4 months. During the most recent session, the man reports that he believes his girlfriend has been cheating on him with multiple friends. He reports that he asked her about the cheating, but each time she denied cheating on him and told him to stop worrying about it. Upon further exploration, the social worker discovers the man has actually been cheating on his girlfriend the past 2 months. What defense mechanism has the man been using? A, denial, B, displacement, C, sublimation, or D, projection. And when you have your answer, type the word blessed in the chat. Opening the polls. Twenty more seconds. Shutting down the polls. The majority think it is D. Second place is A. Third place is B. Fourth place is C. Let's look at it. We're a social worker in a community mental health clinic. So that's who we are and where we are at. working with a 29-year-old male. So that is going to be our client for the past 4 months. Any length of time, hop on top of it because it helps paint the picture of what we're looking at. During the most recent session, any length of time, hop on top of it because it helps paint the picture of what we're looking at this given moment. Man reports that he believes his girlfriend has been cheating on him with multiple friends. He reports that he asked her about the cheating, but each time she denied cheating on him and told him to stop worrying about. Upon further discussion or upon further exploration, any length of time, hop on top of it because it also paints the picture of what we're looking at. Social worker discovers the man has actually been cheating on his girlfriend for the past 2 months. Any length of time, hop on top of it because it helps paint the picture of what we're looking at this given moment. So let's break down each defense mechanism, compare them back to the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So denial is when someone does not acknowledge an action or a behavior by not taking negative criticism or critique. B, displacement is when someone expresses or places their emotions onto someone or something less threatening. C, sublimation is when someone will substitute a positive behavior in place of a negative one. And then D, projection is when someone will put their emotions, thoughts, feelings, and or behaviors onto someone else. So let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So quick review. Social worker, community mental health clinic. That's we are where we're at. 29-year-old male. So that's our client. 4 months. Any like the time, hop on top of it because it also paints a picture of what we're looking at. So we've been working with them for 4 months during the most recent session. Any like the time, hop on top of it because it also paints a picture of what we're looking at. So what's going on right now during this session? The man reports he believes his girlfriend has been cheating on him with multiple friends. He reports he asked her about the cheating, but each time she denied cheating on him and said, stop worrying about it. On further exploration, any length of time, hop on top of it because it also paints the picture of what we're looking at. Social worker discovers the man has been cheating on his girlfriend for the past 2 months. Any length of time, hop on top of it because it also paints the picture of what we're looking at. So keep all that in mind. Let's go through each answer choice. So right off the bat, we are going to rule out A. Why? Because at one point in time, he was potentially denying it because he was accusing somebody else of doing a behavior. However, he was willing to admit to cheating on his girlfriend. So that is the main difference. Is denial would have denied it until the death of them. However, when we explored it a little bit further, the man was actually cheating on his girlfriend. We're also going to rule out C. Why? Because cheating is not a positive behavior. There's not a negative behavior that they have replaced in any way, shape, or form. Because he said, hey, I think my girlfriend's cheating on me. I'm the one that's actually cheating. So there wasn't an exchange of a behavior for another behavior. So now when we need to ask ourselves, is this person placing their emotions onto someone or something less threatening, or is this person having that Iron Man suit of having a projector on their chest and putting their experience onto somebody else? So let's look back at the question to make sure we're not making a mistake. The man reports that he believes his girlfriend has been cheating on him. He asked her about it. She said, I'm not. stop worrying about it. And then we find out he's been cheating on his girlfriend for the past 2 months. So for that reason, we're going to rule out B based on the fact that they are not expressing or placing their emotions onto someone or something less threatening. There are no emotions within this situation. He was doing a behavior. He accused somebody else of doing the behavior, and he was the one that was actually doing the behavior. So the correct answer here is going to be D, projection, because he had that projector on his chest and put it onto his girlfriend when he was the one that was actually doing the behavior. So the correct answer here is D, projection, because he was projecting the behavior of cheating onto his girlfriend. So the correct answer here is D, projection. So that's how we look at that question in particular. Question 8. A social worker in a private practice is completing an intake assessment with a 44-year-old male regarding a recent embezzlement charge. The man reports that he has been under a lot of stress and that being fired from his job has negatively impacted his quality of life. The man reports that he does not understand why he's being charged with embezzlement since his coworker was the person who stole the money. The man reports that his lawyer showed him a video of him signing a fraudulent check, but he does not remember ever doing it. What defense mechanism best explains the man's situation? A, suppression, B, repression, C, denial, or D, rationalization. And when you have your answer, type one thing that you're looking forward to next week. Opening the polls. Twenty more seconds. Shutting down the polls. The majority think it is B. Second place is C. Third place is A. Fourth place is D. Let's look at it. We're a social worker in a private practice. So that's who we are and where we are at, completing an intake assessment. And you like the time, hop on top of it because it helps paint the picture of what we're looking at. So it's our first time meeting with a 44-year-old male. So that is our client regarding a recent embezzlement charge. So that's what brought them in to services. A man reports that he's been under a lot of stress and that being fired from his job has negatively impacted his quality of life. A man reports that he does not understand why he's being charged with embezzlement since his coworker was the person who stole the money. The man reports his lawyer showed him a video of signing a fraudulent check, but he does not ever remember doing it. What defense mechanism best explains the man's situation? So let's break down each defense mechanism, compare back to the question to see what we're looking at in particular. A, suppression is when someone will avoid a thought or feeling with a key emphasis on temporarily and acknowledge it later. B, repression is when someone will press down their feelings and or emotions because they are too painful to process. So it's often related to trauma. C, denial is when someone will not acknowledge an action or thought by not taking criticism or critique. D, rationalization is when someone will explain an unacceptable behavior or feeling in a rational or logical manner. So let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So, quick review. Social worker, private practice, that's who we are, where we are at, completing an intake assessment. And you like the time, hop on top of it because it also paints the picture of what we're looking at. 44-year-old male, that's our client, regarding a recent embezzlement charge, stealing from a company. Man reports he's been under a lot of stress and he's been fired from his job, which has negatively impacted his quality of life. The man reports that he does not understand why he's being charged with embezzlement, since this coworker was the person who stole the money. The man reports that the lawyer showed him a video of him signing a fraudulent check, but he does not remember ever doing it. So keep all that in mind as we go through each answer choice. So right off the bat, we're going to rule out A. Why? Because suppression is where somebody will temporarily and consciously avoid thinking about something, yet acknowledge it later. Our client has stated he has no clue. He doesn't understand why he's being charged, and that he does not ever remember signing a fraudulent check. So A would be within his control of, I'm going to suppress this temporarily, and then I'm going to acknowledge it later. However, he's saying, I have no clue what's going on or what anyone is saying in any way, shape, or form. We're also going to rule out D. Why? Because rationalization would be where he comes up with an excuse of why he's on the video. Oh, yeah, I'm on the video signing that fraudulent check because I had to fake out the camera so that way my coworker could actually sign a fraudulent check and get us the dinero, and then we could cash ourselves out. But he's still saying, I don't understand why I'm being charged, and I don't even remember any of this. Like, I have no idea what you guys are talking about. Wasn't me. So now we're stuck in between. B, repression has his mind pressed it out of existence because it's too painful to process. Or is it denial where he's not acknowledging anything, even though there is evidence in front of him? So let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So it's our first time meeting him regarding an embezzlement charge. He's been under a lot of stress. And being fired has negatively impacted his mental health. So there are a lot of impacts related to what's going on in his situation right now. He says he doesn't understand why he's being charged because his coworker was the one who stole it, and he reports that his lawyer showed him a video of him actually doing it. So is this individual denying that it even is existing by just not acknowledging that the situation is real, or has his mind started to repress or press things out of existence? So for that reason, we're going to rule out C based on the fact that he does acknowledge that the embezzlement happened, he's like, yeah, my coworker totally did that. He was the one that was stealing the money. He would siphon me some money, and then we're A-okay. However, he's like, I'm under a lot of stress. It's negatively impacting my mental health, which could have overloaded this system, which could have been a traumatic event. And he not remember any of the things that are going on. He does acknowledge the fact that the embezzlement was real. However, he doesn't remember ever happening within the situation. So it wasn't like he was voluntarily doing it. So that's why A, suppression is out. C, denial is out based on the fact that he does acknowledge the embezzlement happened. However, he doesn't acknowledge or remember that he was a part of it. And the D is incorrect because he didn't make an excuse within the situation. So the correct answer here is B, repression, because his mind has pressed that memory out of existence or out of consciousness based on the fact that it's too painful for him to process because he's been under a lot of stress and it's negatively impacting his life. And he was shown a video and he's like, I don't even remember this, which could be consistent with repression because if you have a memory pressed down, it takes great deals of effort in order to acknowledge that it is real. So the correct answer here is B, repression. So that's how we look at that question in particular. Question 9. A social worker at a family agency is completing an intake with a 42-year-old female who reports having relationship problems. The woman reports that her boyfriend has been getting frustrated with her spending habits and that at times it causes them to fall behind on bills. The woman reports that she has an admiration for Kylie Jenner and feels compelled to buy whatever she releases so she can be just like her. Which defense mechanism best explains the woman's behavior? A, intellectualization, B, internalization, C, asceticism, or D, introjection. And when you have your answer, type one thing that you're blessed to have in your life right now. Opening the polls. Twenty more seconds. Shutting down the polls. The majority think it is D. Second place is B. Third place is C. Fourth place is A. Let's look at it. We're a social worker at a family agency. So that's who we are and where we're at, completing an intake. And you like the time, hop on top of it because it also paints the picture of what we're looking at. So it's our first time meeting with a 42-year-old female. So that is our client. who reports having a relationship problem. So that's what brought her in to services. One reports that her boyfriend has been getting frustrated with their spending habits, and at times it causes them to fall behind on bills. The one reports that she has an admiration for Kylie Jenner and feels compelled to buy whatever she releases with the purpose so she can be just like her. Which defense mechanism best explains a woman's behavior? So let's break down each defense mechanism, compare back to the question to see what we're looking at in particular. A, intellectualization is when someone obtains information around a stressor in their life and avoids feeling emotions around it. So they strive to understand rather than to feel. B, internalization is when someone will take the opinions, feedback, and values of others and play it out in their life. So their internal changes. C, asceticism is when someone has a set way of doing things. So they are rigid, stubborn, and set in their ways. So they delay pleasure to accomplish a particular goal. D, introjection is when someone will hear an idea from someone that they admire or look up to and play it out in their life. So they introduce or inject something new into their life. So let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. Quick review. Social worker, family agency, that's who we are, where we're at, completing an intake. Any length of time, hop on top of it because it all paints the picture of what we're looking at. So it's our first time meeting with a 42-year-old female, reports having relationship issues. One reports that her boyfriend has been getting frustrated with her spending habits, and at times, it causes them to fall behind on bills. One reports she has an admiration for Kylie Jenner and feels compelled to buy whatever she releases so she can be just like her, just like her, just like her. So keep all that in mind as we go through each answer choice. So right off the bat, we're going to rule out A. Why? Because nowhere does it state that she's obtaining any information related to anything in any way, shape, or form. Now, if it stated that she was trying to obtain information related to her spending habits and why she wanted to be just like Kylie Jenner and not acknowledging what her boyfriend has stated, then we would have intellectualization. We're also going to rule out C, asceticism. Why? Because she's almost exhibiting the opposite of asceticism and 100% focusing on the pleasure that she's experiencing within her life and not actually delaying it in order to accomplish a particular goal, based on the fact that she is compelled to buy whatever she releases. So it's not within her control to be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to skip out on this particular thing. So now we're in between B, internalization of where somebody's opinions, feedback, and values of somebody that they've been told early on in their life is being played out, or is this person introducing something into their life or continuously injecting a concept into their life to reinforce it over time? Let's look back at the question to make sure we're not making a mistake. Woman reports that she's having relationship issues and her boyfriend's getting frustrated with her spending habits because at times it causes them to fall behind on bills, clinically significant impact. She has an admiration for Kylie Jenner, so a particular individual, and she feels compelled to buy whatever she releases just to be like her. So that's a key thing there as well, because she wants to be just like her. So for that reason, we're going to rule out B. Why? Because internalization is where somebody is more on an internal thought process versus trying to emulate what somebody is particularly doing. So the correct answer here is going to be D, introjection, because she's introduced what Kylie Jenner is producing into her life and has continued to inject the concepts such as whatever she is releasing with and for her situation. So A, intellectualization is incorrect because nowhere does it state that she's trying to get as much information as she can. B is incorrect because internal processing has not changed. And C, asceticism is incorrect because it's the total opposite. She's getting all the pleasures that she particularly could want with having a negative impact on her life, such as at times they're falling behind on bills. So the correct answer here is D, introjection, because she's introducing an idea or thought from someone that she admires in order to become just like them, which could lead to identification. So the correct answer here is D, introjection. So that's how we look at that question in particular. Question 10. A social worker at a family agency is meeting with a 50-year-old male who reports having feelings of depression. The man reports that his wife divorced him 3 months ago and that he has not felt right since. The man reports that no one outside of his family knows about the divorce because he's been more productive at work. The man reports that without work, he would have felt entirely useless. Which defense mechanism best explains the man's reaction to the divorce? A, asceticism, B, compensation, C, sublimation, D, suppression. And when you have your answer, type one thing that you learned from the session tonight. Opening the polls. Twenty more seconds. Shutting down the polls. The majority think it is B. Second place is C. Third place is A and D. Let's look at it. We're a social worker at a family agency. So that's who we are and where we are at. Meeting with a 50-year-old male. So that is our client. Reports having feelings of depression. So that is what we have been working on. The man reports that his wife divorced him 3 months ago and that he has not felt right since. And you like the time, hop on top of it because it always paints the picture of what we're looking at this given moment. The man reports that no one outside of his family knows about the divorce because he's been more productive at work. And the man reports that without work, he would feel entirely useless. Which defense mechanism best explains a man's reaction to divorce? So let's break down each defense mechanism, compare back to the question to see what we're looking at in particular. Asceticism is when someone has a rigid way of doing things and will delay pleasure to accomplish a particular goal. Compensation is when someone will overachieve in one area of their life to compensate or make up for failures in other areas. C, sublimation is when someone will substitute a positive behavior in place of a negative one. And then suppression is when someone will avoid the thought or feeling of something with the key emphasis of temporarily and acknowledge it later. So let's look back at the question to see what we're looking at in particular. So quick review. Social worker, family agency. That's who we are, where we're at. 50-year-old male. That's our client who reports having feelings of depression. Man reports his wife divorced him 3 months ago. And you like the time, hop on top of it because it always paints the picture of what we're looking at. So the past 3 months, he's been feeling depressed based on the divorce and that he's not felt right since. The man reports no one outside of his family knows about the divorce because he has been more productive at work. And he reports that without work, he would feel entirely useless. So keep all that in mind as we go through each answer choice. So right off the bat, we're going to rule out D. Why? Because nowhere does it state that he's avoiding the thought or feeling of something temporarily and then acknowledging it later. He states that he got divorced 3 months ago. He's not felt right since, and he has feelings of depression, and that he's been more productive at work. So no one outside of his family knows what the heck is going on. So no one outside of his family knows that he got a divorce and that he's been more productive at work. Suppression would be like, okay, well, I'm going to put off thinking about the divorce and then I'm going to focus on this other thing. But then later on, acknowledge what's going on within Forrest's situation. Nowhere did it state that it stopped him in any way or that it was a temporary thing. We're also going to rule out C. Why? Because nowhere does it state that he had a negative behavior that he was doing after the divorce in any way, shape, or form. It just states that he started coping by working more while trying to cover the fact that he got a divorce 3 months ago. So now we're in between asceticism or compensation. Asceticism is where somebody has a rigid way of doing things, will delay pleasure to accomplish a particular goal, or compensation is where somebody's experienced a failure in one area of life, so they overachieve or do more in another area to make up for it in some way, shape, or form. So let's look back at the question to make sure we're not making a mistake. He's been having feelings of depression. He got divorced 3 months ago. No one outside of his family knows about the divorce. He's been more productive at work. He feels that without work, he would feel entirely useless. So if we think about that, he doesn't have a particular goal that he's focusing on in any way, shape, or form. So we're going to rule out A, and we are going to go with B based on the fact that he has been overachieving at work in order to make up for the failure of the divorce 3 months ago. So A is ruled out because he does not have a particular goal in mind. C is ruled out because there wasn't a negative behavior that he was exhibiting before. And then D is ruled out because he wasn't suppressing his feelings or thoughts about the divorce temporarily and then acknowledging it later. He's been doing B, compensating for the divorce by being more productive at work. So he's been doing more productivity in one area or achieving something in one area to make up for the relationship failure in that other area. So the correct answer here is B, compensation, based on the fact that he's been more productive in one area to make up for another. So the correct answer here is B, compensation. So that's how we look at that question in particular.